The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. Part 1. Preface. In its original form, The Mystery of a Hansom Cab has reached the sale of 375,000 copies in this country, and some few editions in the United States of America. Notwithstanding this, the present publishers have the best of reasons for believing that there are thousands of persons whom the book has never reached. The causes of this have doubtless been many, but chief among them was the form of the publication itself. It is for this section of the public chiefly that the present edition is issued. In placing it before my new readers, I have been asked by the publishers thoroughly to revise the work, and at the same time, to set at rest the many conflicting reports concerning it and myself, which have been current since its initial issue. The first of these requests I have complied with, and the many typographic and other errors which disfigured the first edition have, I think I can safely say, now disappeared. The second request I am about to fulfill, but in order to do so, I must ask my readers to go back with me to the beginning of all things, so far as this special book is concerned. The writing of the book was due more to accident than to design. I was bent on becoming a dramatist, but, being quite unknown, I found it impossible to induce the managers of the Melbourne theaters to accept, or even to read a play. At length it occurred to me I might further my purpose by writing a novel. I should at all events secure a certain amount of local attention. Up to that time I had written only 1 or 2 short stories, and The Cab was not only the first book I ever published, but the first book I ever wrote. So to youth and lack of experience must be ascribed whatever was wanting in the book. I repeat that the story was written only to attract local attention, and no one was more astonished than I when it passed beyond the narrow circle for which it had originally been intended. My mind made up on this point, I inquired of a leading Melbourne bookseller what style of book he sold most of. He replied that the detective stories of Gorby had a large sale, and as at this time I had never even heard of this author, I bought all his works, 11 or thereabouts, and read them carefully. The style of these stories attracted me, and I determined to write a book of the same class, containing a mystery, a murder, and a description of low life in Melbourne. This was the origin of The Cab. The central idea, i.e., the murder in a cab, came to me while driving at a late hour to St. Kilda, a suburb of Melbourne, but it took some time and much thought to work it out to a logical conclusion. I was 2 months sketching out the skeleton of the novel, but even so, when I had written it, the result proved unsatisfactory, for I found I had not sufficiently well concealed the mystery upon which the whole interest of the book depended. In the first draft I made Frettleby the criminal, but on reading over the MS, I found that his guilt was so obvious that I wrote out the story for a second time, introducing the character of Morland as a scapegoat. Mother Guttersnipe I unearthed in the slums off Little Burke Street, and I gave what I am afraid was perhaps too vivid a picture of her language and personality. These I have toned down in the present edition. Carlton and the 2 lodging house keepers were actual personages whom I knew very well, and I do not think I have exaggerated their idiosyncrasies, although many have, I believe, doubted the existence of such oddities. All the scenes in the book, especially the slums, are described from personal observation, and I passed a great many nights in Little Burke Street, gathering material. Having completed the book, I tried to get it published, but everyone to whom I offered it refused even to look at the manuscript on the ground that no colonial could write anything worth reading. They gave no reason for this extraordinary opinion, but it was sufficient for them, and they laughed to scorn the idea that any good could come out of Nazareth, i.e., the colonies. The story thus being boycotted on all hands, I determined to publish it myself, and accordingly an edition of, I think, some 5,000 copies was brought out at my own cost. Contrary to the expectations of the publishers, and I must add to my own, the whole edition went off in 3 weeks, and the public demanded a second. This also sold rapidly, and after some months, proposals were made to me that the book should be brought out in London. Later on I parted with the book to several speculators, who formed themselves into what they called the Hansom Cab Publishing Company. Taking the book to London, they published it there with great success, and it had a phenomenal sale which brought in a large sum of money. The success was, in the first instance, due, in no small degree, to a very kind and generous criticism written by Mr. Clement Scott. I may here state that I had nothing to do with the company, nor did I receive any money for the English sale of the book beyond what I sold it for. And as a matter of fact, I did not arrive in England until a year after the novel was published. I have heard it declared that the plot is founded on a real criminal case. But such a statement is utterly without foundation, as the story is pure fiction from beginning to end. Several people before, and since my arrival in England, have assumed the authorship of the book to themselves, and one gentleman went so far as to declare that he would shoot me if I claimed to have written it. I am glad to say that up to the present he has not carried out his intention. Another individual had his cards printed, Fergus Hume, author of The Mystery of a Hansom Cab, and also added the price for which he was prepared to write a similar book. Many of the papers put this last piece of eccentricity down to my account. I may state in conclusion that I belong to New Zealand and not to Australia, that I am a barrister and not a retired policeman, that I am yet 2 decades off 50 years of age, that Fergus Hume is my real name and not a nom de plume, and finally, that far from making a fortune out of the book, all I received for the English and American rights, previous to the issue of this revised edition by my present publishers, was the sum of £50. With this I take my leave, and I trust that the present edition may prove as successful as did the first. Chapter 1. The following report appeared in the Argus newspaper of Saturday, the July 28th, 18. Truth is said to be stranger than fiction, and certainly the extraordinary murder which took place in Melbourne on Thursday night, or rather Friday morning, goes a long way towards verifying this saying. A crime has been committed by an unknown assassin within a short distance of the principal streets of this great city, and is surrounded by an impenetrable mystery. Indeed, from the nature of the crime itself, the place where it was committed, and the fact that the assassin has escaped without leaving a trace behind him, it would seem as though the case itself had been taken bodily from one of Gaboriau's novels, and that his famous detective Lecoq alone would be able to unravel it. The facts of the case are simply these. On the 27th day of July, at the hour of 20 minutes to 2 o'clock in the morning, a hansom cab drove up to the police station in Grey Street, St. Kilda, and the driver made the startling statement that his cab contained the body of a man who he had reason to believe had been murdered. Being taken into the presence of the inspector, the cabman, who gave his name as Malcolm Royston, related the following strange story. At the hour of 1 o'clock in the morning, he was driving down Collins Street East when, as he was passing the Burke and Wills Monument, he was hailed by a gentleman standing at the corner by the Scotch Church. He immediately drove up and saw that the gentleman who hailed him was supporting the deceased, who appeared to be intoxicated. Both were in evening dress, but the deceased had on no overcoat, while the other wore a short covert coat of a light fawn color, which was open. As Royston drove up, the gentleman in the light coat said, "Look here, cabby, here's some fellow awfully tight. You'd better take him home." Royston then asked him if the drunken man was his friend, but this the other denied, saying that he had just picked him up from the footpath and did not know him from Adam. At this moment the deceased turned his face up to the light of the lamp under which both were standing, and the other seemed to recognize him, for he recoiled a pace, letting the drunken man fall in a heap on the pavement, and gasping out, he turned on his heel and walked rapidly away down Russell Street in the direction of Burke Street. Royston was staring after him and wondering at his strange conduct, when he was recalled to himself by the voice of the deceased, who had struggled to his feet and was holding on to the lamp-post, swaying to and fro. "I want Guillaume," he said in a thick voice, "Street Point Kilda." He then tried to get into the cab but was too drunk to do so, and finally sat down again on the pavement. Seeing this, Royston got down, and lifting him up, helped him into the cab with some considerable difficulty. The deceased fell back into the cab, and seemed to drop off to sleep. So, after closing the door, Royston turned to remount his driving seat, when he found the gentleman in the light coat whom he had seen holding up the deceased, close to his elbow. Royston said, "Oh, you've come back," and the other answered, "Yes, I've changed my mind, and will see him home." As he said this, he opened the door of the cab, stepped in beside the deceased, and told Royston to drive down to St. Kilda. Royston, who was glad that the friend of the deceased had come to look after him, drove as he had been directed, but near the Church of England Grammar School, on the St. Kilda Road, the gentleman in the light coat called out to him to stop. He did so, and the gentleman got out of the cab, closing the door after him. "He won't let me take him home," he said, so I'll just walk back to the city, and you can drive into St. Kilda." "What street, sir?" asked Royston. "Grey Street, I fancy," said the other. "But my friend will direct you when you get to the junction." "Any too much on, sir?" said Royston dubiously. "Oh, no. I think he'll be able to tell you where he lives. It's Grey Street or Ackland Street, I fancy. I don't know which." He then opened the door of the cab and looked in. "Good night, old man," he said. The other apparently did not answer, for the gentleman in the light coat, shrugging his shoulders and muttering "sulky brute," closed the door again. He then gave Royston half a sovereign, lit a cigarette, and after making a few remarks about the beauty of the night, walked off quickly in the direction of Melbourne. Royston drove down to the junction, and having stopped there, according to his instructions, he asked his fare several times where he was to drive him to. Receiving no response, and thinking that the deceased was too drunk to answer, he got down from his seat, opened the door of the cab, and found the deceased lying back in the corner with a handkerchief across his mouth. He put out his hand with the intention of rousing him, thinking that he had gone to sleep. But on touching him, the deceased fell forward, and on examination, to his horror, he found that he was quite dead. Alarmed at what had taken place, and suspecting the gentleman in the light coat, he drove to the police station at St. Kilda, and there made the above report. The body of the deceased was taken out of the cab and brought into the station, a doctor being sent for at once. On his arrival, however, he found that life was quite extinct, and also discovered that the handkerchief which was tied lightly over the mouth was saturated with chloroform. He had no hesitation in stating that from the way in which the handkerchief was placed, and the presence of chloroform, that a murder had been committed, and from all appearances the deceased died easily and without a struggle. The deceased is a slender man, of medium height, with a dark complexion, and is dressed in evening dress, which will render identification difficult, as it is a costume which has no distinctive mark to render it noticeable. There were no papers or cards found on the deceased from which his name could be discovered, and the clothing was not marked in any way. The handkerchief, however, which was tied across his mouth, was of white silk, and marked in one of the corners with the letters OW in red silk. The assassin, of course, may have used his own handkerchief to commit the crime, so that if the initials are those of his name, they may ultimately lead to his detection. There will be an inquest held on the body of the deceased this morning, when, no doubt, some evidence may be elicited which may solve the mystery. In Monday morning's issue of the Argus, the following article appeared with reference to the matter. The following additional evidence which has been obtained may throw some light on the mysterious murder in a hansom cab of which we gave a full description in Saturday's issue. Another hansom cabman called at the police office and gave a clue which will, no doubt, prove of value to the detectives in their search for the murderer. He states that he was driving up the St. Kilda Road on Friday morning about 1:30 o'clock, when he was hailed by a gentleman in a light coat who stepped into the cab and told him to drive to Powlett Street in East Melbourne. He did so, and after paying him, the gentleman got out at the corner of Wellington Parade and Powlett Street and walked slowly up Powlett Street, while the cab drove back to town. Here all clue ends, but there can be no doubt in the minds of our readers as to the identity of the man in the light coat who got out of Royston's cab on the St. Kilda Road, with the one who entered the other cab and alighted therefrom at Powlett Street. There could have been no struggle, as had any taken place the cabman, Royston, surely would have heard the noise. The supposition is, therefore, that the deceased was too drunk to make any resistance, and that the other, watching his opportunity, placed the handkerchief saturated with chloroform over the mouth of his victim. Then, after perhaps a few ineffectual struggles, the latter would succumb to the effects of his inhalation. The man in the light coat, judging from his conduct before getting into the cab, appears to have known the deceased, though the circumstance of his walking away on recognition and returning again shows that his attitude towards the deceased was not altogether a friendly one. The difficulty is where to start from in the search after the author of what appears to be a deliberate murder, as the deceased seems to be unknown, and his presumed murderer has escaped. But it is impossible that the body can remain long without being identified by someone, as though Melbourne is a large city, yet it is neither Paris nor London, where a man can disappear in a crowd and never be heard of again. The first thing to be done is to establish the identity of the deceased, and then, no doubt, A clue will be obtained leading to the detection of the man in the light coat who appears to have been the perpetrator of the crime. It is of the utmost importance that the mystery in which the crime is shrouded should be cleared up, not only in the interests of justice, but also in those of the public, taking place as it did in a public conveyance and in the public street. To think that the author of such a crime is at present at large, walking in our midst, and perhaps preparing for the committal of another, is enough to shake the strongest nerves. In one of Du Boisgobey's stories, entitled An Omnibus Mystery, a murder closely resembling this tragedy takes place in an omnibus, but we question if even that author would have been daring enough to write about a crime being committed in such an unlikely place as a hansom cab. Here is a great chance for some of our detectives to render themselves famous, and we feel sure that they will do their utmost to trace the author of this cowardly and dastardly murder. Chapter 2. The Evidence at the Inquest. At the inquest held on the body found in the Hansom Cab, the following articles taken from the deceased were placed on the table. 1. £2 10 shillings in gold and silver. 2. The white silk handkerchief which was saturated with chloroform, and was found tied across the mouth of the deceased, marked with the letters OW in red silk. 3. A cigarette case of Russian leather, half filled with Old Judge cigarettes. 4. A left-hand white glove of kid, rather soiled, with black seams down the back. Samuel Gorby, of the detective office, was present in order to see if anything might be said by the witnesses likely to point to the cause or to the author of the crime. The first witness called was Malcolm Royston, in whose cab the crime had been committed. He told the same story as had already appeared in the Argus, and the following facts were elicited by the coroner. Question: Can you give a description of the gentleman in the light coat who was holding the deceased when you drove up? Answer: I did not observe him very closely, as my attention was taken up by the deceased, and besides, the gentleman in the light coat was in the shadow. Question: Describe him from what you saw of him. Answer: He was fair, I think, because I could see his mustache, rather tall, and an evening dress, with a light coat over it. I could not see his face very plainly, as he wore a soft felt hat, which was pulled down over his eyes. Question: What kind of hat was it he wore? A wide-awake? Answer: Yes. The brim was turned down, and I could see only his mouth and mustache. Question: What did he say when you asked him if he knew the deceased? Answer: He said he didn't, that he had just picked him up. Question: And afterwards he seemed to recognize him? Answer: Yes. When the deceased looked up, he said you, and let him fall onto the ground. Then he walked away towards Burke Street. Question: Did he look back? Answer: Not that I saw. Question: How long were you looking after him? Answer: About a minute. Question: And when did you see him again? Answer: After I put deceased into the cab, I turned round and found him at my elbow. Question: And what did he say? Answer: I said, "Oh, you've come back." And he said, "Yes, I've changed my mind, and we'll see him home." And then he got into the cab and told me to drive to St. Kilda. Question: He spoke then as if he knew the deceased? Answer: Yes. I thought that he recognized him only when he looked up, and perhaps having had a row with him walked away, but thought he'd come back. Question: Did you see him coming back? Answer: No. The first I saw of him was at my elbow when I turned. Question: And when did he get out? Just as I was turning down by the grammar school on the St. Kilda Road. Answer: Did you hear any sounds of fighting or struggling in the cab during the drive? Answer: No. The road was rather rough, and the noise of the wheels going over the stones would have prevented my hearing anything. Question: When the gentleman in the light coat got out, did he appear disturbed? Answer: No. He was perfectly calm. Question: How could you tell that? Answer: Because the moon had risen, and I could see plainly. Question: Did you see his face then? Answer: No. His hat was pulled down over it. I only saw as much as I did when he entered the cab in Collins Street. Question: Were his clothes torn or disarranged in any way? Answer: No. The only difference I remarked in him was that his coat was buttoned. Question: And was it open when he got in? Answer: No, but it was when he was holding up the deceased. Question: Then he buttoned it before he came back and got into the cab? Answer: Yes. I suppose so. Question: What did he say when he got out of the cab on the St. Kilda Road? Answer: He said that the deceased would not let him take him home, and that he would walk back to Melbourne. Question: And you asked him where you were to drive the deceased to? Answer: Yes. and he said that the deceased lived either in Grey Street or Ackland Street, St. Kilda, but that the deceased would direct me at the junction. Question: did you not think that the deceased was too drunk to direct you? Answer: yes, I did. But his friend said that the sleep and the shaking of the cab would sober him a bit by the time I got to the junction. Question: the gentleman in the light coat apparently did not know where the deceased lived? Answer: no. He said it was either in Ackland Street or Grey Street. Question: did you not think that curious? Answer: no. I thought he might be a club friend of the deceased. Question: for how long did the man in the light coat talk to you? Answer: about 5 minutes. Question: and during that time, you heard no noise in the cab? Answer: no. I thought the deceased had gone to sleep. Question: and after the man in the light coat said good night to the deceased, what happened? Answer: he lit a cigarette, gave me a half-sovereign, and walked off towards Melbourne. Question: did you observe if the gentleman in the light coat had his handkerchief with him? Answer: oh yes, because he dusted his boots with it. The road was very dusty. Question: did you notice any striking peculiarity about him? Answer: well, no, except that he wore a diamond ring. Question: what was there peculiar about that? Answer: he wore it on the forefinger of the right hand, and I never saw it that way before. Question: when did you notice this? Answer: when he was lighting his cigarette. Question: how often did you call to the deceased when you got to the junction? Answer: 3 or 4 times. I then got down and found he was quite dead. Question: how was he lying? Answer: he was doubled up in the far corner of the cab, very much in the same position as I left him when I put him in. His head was hanging on one side, and there was a handkerchief across his mouth. When I touched him, he fell into the other corner of the cab, and then I found out he was dead. I immediately drove to the Street Kilda police station and told the police. At the conclusion of Royston's evidence, during which Gorby had been continually taking notes, Robert Chinston was called. He deposed: I am a duly qualified medical practitioner residing in Collins Street East. I made a post-mortem examination of the body of the deceased on Friday. Question: that was within a few hours of his death? Answer: yes. Judging from the position of the handkerchief and the presence of chloroform that the deceased had died from the effects of anesthesia, and knowing how rapidly the poison evaporates, I made the examination at once. Go on, sir. Dr. Chinston: externally, the body was healthy-looking and well-nourished. There were no marks of violence. The staining apparent at the back of the legs and trunk was due to post-mortem congestion. Internally, the brain was hyperemic, and there was a considerable amount of congestion, especially apparent in the superficial vessels. There was no brain disease. The lungs were healthy, but slightly congested. On opening the thorax, there was a faint spirituous odor discernible. The stomach contained about a pint of completely digested food. The heart was flaccid. The right heart contained a considerable quantity of dark, fluid blood. There was a tendency to fatty degeneration of that organ. I am of opinion that the deceased died from the inhalation of some such vapor as chloroform or methylene. Question: you say there was a tendency to fatty degeneration of the heart? Would that have anything to do with the death of deceased? Answer: not of itself. But chloroform administered while the heart was in such a state would have a decided tendency to accelerate the fatal result. At the same time, I may mention that the post-mortem signs of poisoning by chloroform are mostly negative. Dr. Chinston was then permitted to retire, and Clement Rankin, another hansom cabman, was called. He deposed: I am a cabman, living in Collingwood, and usually drive a hansom cab. I remember Thursday last, I had driven a party down to St. Kilda and was returning about 1:30 o'clock. A short distance past the grammar school, I was hailed by a gentleman in a light coat. He was smoking a cigarette and told me to drive him to Pallet Street, East Melbourne. I did so, and he got out at the corner of Wellington Parade and Pallet Street. He paid me half a sovereign for my fare, and then walked up Pallet Street while I drove back to town. Question: what time was it when you stopped at Pallet Street? Answer: 2 o'clock exactly. Question: how do you know? Answer: because it was a still night, and I heard the post office clock strike 2 o'clock. Question: did you notice anything peculiar about the man in the light coat? Answer: no. He looked just the same as anyone else. I thought he was some swell of the town out for a lark. His hat was pulled down over his eyes, and I could not see his face. Question: did you notice if he wore a ring? Answer: yes, I did. When he was handing me the half-sovereign, I saw he had a diamond ring on the forefinger of his right hand. Question: he did not say why he was on the St. Kilda Road at such an hour? Answer: no, he did not. Clement Rankin was then ordered to stand down, and the coroner then summed up in an address of half an hour's duration. There was, he pointed out, no doubt that the death of the deceased had resulted not from natural causes, but from the effects of poisoning. Only slight evidence had been obtained up to the present time regarding the circumstances of the case, but the only person who could be accused of committing the crime was the unknown man who entered the cab with the deceased on Friday morning at the corner of the Scotch Church, near the Burke and Wills Monument. It had been proved that the deceased, when he entered the cab, was to all appearances in good health, though in a state of intoxication, and the fact that he was found by the cabman, Royston, after the man in the light coat had left the cab, with a handkerchief saturated with chloroform tied over his mouth, would seem to show that he had died through the inhalation of chloroform, which had been deliberately administered. All the obtainable evidence in the case was circumstantial, but nevertheless showed conclusively that a crime had been committed. Therefore, as the circumstances of the case pointed to one conclusion, the jury could not do otherwise than frame a verdict in accordance with that conclusion. The jury retired at 4 o'clock, and after an absence of a quarter of an hour, returned with the following verdict: that the deceased, whose name there is no evidence to determine, died on the 27th day of July from the effects of poison, namely chloroform, feloniously administered by some person unknown, and the jury, on their oaths, say that the said unknown person feloniously, willfully, and maliciously did murder the said deceased. Chapter 3. £100 Reward. VR. Murder. £100 Reward. Whereas on Friday, the 27th day of July, the body of a man, name unknown, was found in a hansom cab. And whereas, at an inquest held at St. Kilda on the 30th day of July, a verdict of willful murder against some person unknown was brought in by the jury. The deceased is of medium height, with a dark complexion, dark hair, clean shave, has a mole on the left temple, and was dressed in evening dress. Notice is hereby given that a reward of £100 will be paid by the government for such information as will lead to the conviction of the murderer, who is presumed to be a man who entered the hansom cab with the deceased at the corner of Collins and Russell Streets on the morning of the 27th day of July. Chapter 4. Mr. Gorby makes a start. Well, said Mr. Gorby, addressing his reflection in the looking-glass, I've been finding out things these last 20 years, but this is a puzzler, and no mistake. Mr. Gorby was shaving, and, as was his usual custom, conversed with his reflection. Being a detective, and of an extremely reticent disposition, he never talked outside about his business, or made a confidant of anyone. When he did want to unbosom himself, he retired to his bedroom and talked to his reflection in the mirror. This method of procedure he found to work capitally, for it relieved his sometimes overburdened mind with absolute security to himself. Did not the barber of Midas, when he found out what was under the royal crown of his master, fret and chafe over his secret, until one morning he stole to the reeds by the river, and whispered, "Midas has ass's ears"? In the like manner Mr. Gorby felt a longing at times to give speech to his innermost secrets, and having no fancy for chattering to the air, he made his mirror his confidant. So far it had never betrayed him, while for the rest it joyed him to see his own jolly red face nodding gravely at him from out the shining surface, like a mandarin. This morning the detective was unusually animated in his confidences to his mirror. At times, too, a puzzled expression would pass over his face. The hansom cab murder had been placed in his hands for solution, and he was trying to think how he should make a beginning. "Hang it," he said, thoughtfully stropping his razor. "A thing with an end must have a start, and if I don't get the start, how am I to get the end?" As the mirror did not answer this question, Mr. Gorby lathered his face and started shaving in a somewhat mechanical fashion, for his thoughts were with the case, and ran on in this manner. "Here's a man, well, say a gentleman, who gets drunk and therefore don't know what he's up to. Another gent who is on the square comes up and sings out for a cab for him. First he says he don't know him, and then he shows plainly he does. He walks away in a temper, changes his mind, comes back and gets into the cab after telling the cabbie to drive down to St. Kilda. Then he polishes the drunk one off with chloroform, gets out of the cab, jumps into another, and after getting out at Powlett Street, vanishes. That's the riddle I've got to find out, and I don't think the Sphinx ever had a harder one. There are 3 things to be discovered. First, who was the dead man? Second, what was he killed for? And third, who did it? Once I get hold of the first, the other 2 won't be very hard to find out, for one can tell pretty well from a man's life whether it's to anyone's interest that he should be got off the books. The man that murdered that chap must have had some strong motive, and I must find out what that motive was. Love? No, it wasn't that. Men in love don't go to such lengths in real life. They do in novels and plays, but I've never seen it occurring in my experience. Robbery? No, there was plenty of money in his pocket. Revenge? Now, really it might be that it's a kind of thing that carries most people further than they want to go. There was no violence used, for his clothes weren't torn. So he must have been taken sudden, and before he knew what the other chap was up to. By the way, I don't think I examined his clothes sufficiently. There might be something about them to give a clue. At any rate, it's worth looking after, so I'll start with his clothes. So Mr. Gorby, having dressed and breakfasted, walked quickly to the police station, where he asked for the clothes of the deceased to be shown to him. When he received them, he retired into a corner and commenced an exhaustive examination of them. There was nothing remarkable about the coat. It was merely a well-cut and well-made dress coat. So with a grunt of dissatisfaction, Mr. Gorby threw it aside and picked up the waistcoat. Here he found something to interest him in the shape of a pocket made on the left-hand side and on the inside of the garment. Now, what the deuce is this for? Said Mr. Gorby, scratching his head. It ain't usual for a dress waistcoat to have a pocket on its inside, as I'm aware of. And, continued the detective, greatly excited, this ain't Taylor's work. He did it himself, and jolly badly he did it too. Now he must have taken the trouble to make this pocket himself, so that no one else would know anything about it, and it was made to carry something valuable. So valuable that he had to carry it with him even when he wore evening clothes. Ah! Here's a tear on the side nearest the outside of the waistcoat. Something has been pulled out roughly. I begin to see now. The dead man possessed something which the other man wanted, and which he knew the dead one carried about with him. He sees him drunk, gets into the cab with him, and tries to get what he wants. The dead man resists, upon which the other kills him by means of the chloroform which he had with him, and being afraid that the cab will stop, and he will be found out, snatches what he wants out of the pocket so quickly that he tears the waistcoat, and then makes off. That's clear enough, but the question is, what was it he wanted? A case with jewels? No, it could not have been anything so bulky, or the dead man would never have carried it about inside his waistcoat. It was something flat which could easily lie in the pocket, a paper, some valuable paper which the assassin wanted, and for which he killed the other. This is all very well, said Mr. Gorby, throwing down the waistcoat and rising. I have found number 2 before number 1. The first question is, who is the murdered man? He's a stranger in Melbourne, that's pretty clear, or else someone would have been sure to recognize him before now, by the description given in the reward. Now, I wonder if he has any relations here? No, he can't, or else they would have made inquiries before this. Well, there's one thing certain. He must have had a landlady or landlord, unless he slept in the open air. He can't have lived in an hotel, as the landlord of any hotel in Melbourne would have recognized him from the description, especially when the whole place is ringing with the murder. Private lodgings more like, and a landlady who doesn't read the papers and doesn't gossip, or she'd have known all about it by this time. Now, if he did live, as I think, in private lodgings and suddenly disappeared, his landlady wouldn't keep quiet. It's a whole week since the murder, and as the lodger has not been seen or heard of, the landlady will naturally make inquiries. If, however, as I surmise, the lodger is a stranger, she will not know where to inquire. Therefore, under these circumstances, the most natural thing for her to do would be to advertise for him. So I'll have a look at the newspapers. Mr. Gorby got a file of the different newspapers and looked carefully through those columns in which missing friends and people who will hear something to their advantage are generally advertised for. He was murdered, said Mr. Gorby to himself, on a Friday morning between 1 and 2 o'clock, so he might stay away till Monday without exciting any suspicion. On Monday, however, the landlady would begin to feel uneasy, and on Tuesday she would advertise for him. Therefore, said Mr. Gorby, running his fat finger down the column, Wednesday it is. It did not appear in Wednesday's paper, neither did it in Thursday's. But in Friday's issue, exactly 1 week after the murder, Mr. Gorby suddenly came upon the following advertisement. If Mr. Oliver White does not return to Possum Villa, Grey Street, St. Kilda, before the end of the week, his rooms will be let again. Rubina Hableton. Oliver White, repeated Mr. Gorby slowly, and the initials on the pocket handkerchief which was proved to have belonged to the deceased were O.W. So his name is Oliver White, is it? Now, I wonder if Rubina Hableton knows anything about this matter. At any rate, said Mr. Gorby, putting on his hat, as I'm fond of sea breezes, I think I'll go down and call at Possum Villa, Grey Street, St. Kilda. Chapter 5. Mrs. Hamilton unbosoms herself. Mrs. Hableton was a lady with a grievance, as anybody who happened to become acquainted with her soon found out. It is Beaconsfield who says in one of his novels that no one is so interesting as when he is talking about himself. And, judging Mrs. Hableton by this statement, she was an extremely fascinating individual, as she never by any chance talked upon any other subject. What was the threat of a Russian invasion to her, so long as she had her special grievance? Once let that be removed, and she would have time to attend to such minor details as affected the colony. Mrs. Hableton's particular grievance was one of money. Not by any means an uncommon one, you might remind her, but she snappishly would tell you that she knowed that, but some people weren't like other people. In time one came to learn what she meant by this. She had come to the colonies in the early days when the making of money in appreciable quantity was an easier matter than it is now. Owing to a bad husband, she had failed to save any. The late Mr. Hableton, for he had long since departed this life, had been addicted to alcohol, and at those times when he should have been earning, he was usually to be found in a drinking shanty, spending his wife's earnings in shouting for himself and his friends. The constant drinking and the hot Victorian climate soon carried him off, and when Mrs. Hableton had seen him safely under the ground in the Melbourne cemetery, she returned home to survey her position and see how it could be bettered. She gathered together a little money from the wreck of her fortune, and land being cheap, purchased a small section at St. Kilda and built a house on it. She supported herself by going out charing, taking in sewing, and acting as a sick nurse, so, among this multiplicity of occupations, she managed to exist fairly well. And in truth it was somewhat hard upon Mrs. Hableton, for at the time when she should have been resting and reaping the fruit of her early industry, she was obliged to toil more assiduously than ever. It was little consolation to her that she was but a type of many women who, hard-working and thrifty themselves, are married to men who are nothing but an incubus to their wives and to their families. Small wonder, then, that Mrs. Hableton should condense all her knowledge of the male sex into the one bitter aphorism, men as brutes. Possum Villa was an unpretentious-looking place, with one bow window and a narrow veranda in front. It was surrounded by a small garden in which were a few sparse flowers, the especial delight of Mrs. Hableton. It was her way to tie an old handkerchief round her head and to go out into the garden and dig and water her beloved flowers until, from sheer desperation at the overwhelming odds, they gave up all attempt to grow. She was engaged in this favorite occupation about a week after her lodger had gone. She wondered where he was. Lying drunk in a public ooze, I'll be bound, she said, viciously pulling up a weed. Spendin' is rent and a spilin' is inside with beer. Men is brutes, drat 'em. Just as she said this, a shadow fell across the garden, and on looking up, she saw a man leaning over the fence, staring at her. Get out, she said sharply, rising from her knees and shaking her trowel at the intruder. I don't want no apples today, and I don't care how cheap you sells 'em. Mrs. Hableton evidently labored under the delusion that the man was a hawker, but seeing no handcart with him, she changed her mind. You're talking a plan of the ooze to rob it, are you? She said. Well, you needn't, 'cause there ain't nothing to rob. The silver spoons as belonged to my father's mother, avin gone down my bands throat long ago, and I ain't 'ad money to buy more. I'm a lone poosin as is put on by brutes like you, and I'll thank you to leave the fence I bought with my own hard-earned money alone and get out. Mrs. Hableton stopped short for want of breath and stood shaking her trowel and gasping like a fish out of water. My dear lady, said the man at the fence, mildly, are you? "No, I ain't," retorted Mrs. Hableton, fiercely. "I ain't neither a member of the ooze, nor a school teacher, to answer your questions. I'm a woman as pays my rates and taxes, and don't gossip, nor read your rubbishin' newspapers, nor care for the roostings. No how, so get out." "Don't read the papers?" repeated the man in a satisfied tone. "Ah, that accounts for it." Mrs. Hableton stared suspiciously at the intruder. He was a burly-looking man, with a jovial red face, clean-shaven, and his sharp, shrewd-looking gray eyes twinkled like two stars. He was well-dressed in a suit of light clothes, and wore a stiffly starched white waistcoat with a massive gold chain stretched across it. Altogether, he gave Mrs. Hableton finally the impression of being a well-to-do tradesman, and she mentally wondered what he wanted. "What do I want?" she asked abruptly. "Does Mr. Oliver White live here?" asked the stranger. "He do, and he don't," answered Mrs. Hableton epigrammatically. "I ain't seen him for over a week, so I suppose he's gone on the drink, like the rest of him, but I've put something in the paper as'll pull him up pretty sharp, and let him know I ain't a carpet to be trod on. And if you're a friend of him, you can tell him from me he's a brute, and it's no more but what I expected of him, he bein' a male." The stranger waited placidly during the outburst, and Mrs. Hableton, having stopped for want of breath, he interposed quietly. "Can I speak to you for a few moments?" "And who's a stoppin' of you?" said Mrs. Hableton defiantly. "Go on with you. Not as I expects the truth from a male, but go on." "Well, really," said the other, looking up at the cloudless blue sky, and wiping his face with a gaudy red silk pocket-handkerchief. "It is rather hot, you know, and—" Mrs. Hableton did not give him time to finish, but walking to the gate, opened it with a jerk. "Use your legs and walk in," she said, and the stranger having done so, she led the way into the house, and into a small, neat sitting room, which seemed to overflow with antimacassars, wool mats, and wax flowers. There were also a row of emu eggs on the mantelpiece, a cutlass on the wall, and a grimy line of hard-looking little books, set in a stiff row on a shelf, presumably for ornament, for their appearance in no way tempted one to read them. The furniture was of horsehair, and everything was hard and shiny, so when the stranger sat down in the slippery-looking armchair that Mrs. Hableton pushed towards him, he could not help thinking it had been stuffed with stones. It felt so cold and hard. The lady herself sat opposite to him in another hard chair, and having taken the handkerchief off her head, folded it carefully, laid it on her lap, and then looked straight at her unexpected visitor. "Now then," she said, letting her mouth fly open so rapidly that it gave one the impression that it was moved by strings like a marionette. "Who are you? What are you? And what do you want?" The stranger put his red silk handkerchief into his hat, placed it on the table, and answered deliberately. "My name is Gorby. I am a detective. I want Mr. Oliver White." "He ain't here," said Mrs. Hableton, thinking that White had got into trouble and was in danger of arrest. "I know that," answered Mr. Gorby. "Then where is he?" Mr. Gorby answered abruptly, and watched the effect of his words. "He is dead." Mrs. Hableton grew pale and pushed back her chair. "No," she cried. "He never killed him, did he?" "Who never killed him?" queried Mr. Gorby, sharply. Mrs. Hableton evidently knew more than she intended to say, for, recovering herself with a violent effort, she answered evasively. "He never killed himself?" Mr. Gorby looked at her keenly, and she returned his gaze with a defiant stare. "Clever," muttered the detective to himself. "Knows something more than she chooses to tell, but I'll get it out of her." He paused a moment, and then went on smoothly. "Oh no, he did not commit suicide. What makes you think so?" Mrs. Hableton did not answer, but, rising from her seat, went over to a hard and shiny-looking sideboard, from whence she took a bottle of brandy and a small wine glass. Half filling the glass, she drank it off and returned to her seat. "I don't take much of that stuff," she said, seeing the detective's eyes fixed curiously on her, "but you have given me such a turn that I must take something to steady my nerves. What do you want me to do?" "Tell me all you know," said Mr. Gorby, keeping his eyes fixed on her face. "Where was Mr. White killed?" she asked. "He was murdered in a hansom cab on the St. Kilda Road." "In the open street?" she asked in a startled tone. "Yes, in the open street." "Ah!" She drew a long breath and closed her lips firmly. Mr. Gorby said nothing. He saw that she was deliberating whether or not to speak, and a word from him might seal her lips, so, like a wise man, he kept silent. He obtained his reward sooner than he expected. Mr. Gorby, she said at length, I have had a hard struggle all my life, which it came along of a bad husband, who was a brute and a drunkard, so, God knows, I ain't got much inducement to think well of the lot of you. But murder, she shivered slightly, though the room was quite warm. I didn't think of that. In connection with whom? Mr. White, of course, she answered, hurriedly. And who else? I don't know. Then there is nobody else? Well, I don't know, I'm not sure. The detective was puzzled. What do you mean? He asked. I will tell you all I know, said Mrs. Hableton. And if he's innocent, God will help him. If who is innocent? I'll tell you everything from the start, said Mrs. Hableton. And you can judge for yourself. Mr. Gorby assented, and she began. It's only 2 months ago since I decided to take in lodgers. But Sharon's hard work and sewing's trying for the eyes, so, being a lone woman, Avon been badly treated by a brute, who is now dead, which I was a good wife to him. I thought lodgers, you'd help me a little, so I put a notice in the paper, and Mr. Oliver White took the rooms 2 months ago. What was he like? Not very tall, dark face, no whiskers nor mustache, and quite the gentleman. Anything peculiar about him? Mrs. Hableton thought for a moment. Well, she said at length, he had a mole on his left temple, but it was covered with his hair, and few people you'd have seen it. The very man, said Gorby to himself. I'm on the right path. Mr. White said he had just come from England, went on the woman. Which, thought Mr. Gorby, accounts for the corpse not being recognized by friends. He took the rooms and said he'd stay with me for 6 months, and paid a week's rent in advance. And he allays paid up regular like a respectable man, though I don't believe in him myself. He said he'd lots of friends, and used to go out every night. Who were his friends? That I can't tell you, for East were very close, and when he went out of doors I never knowed where he went, which is just like him. For they ses they're going to work, and you finds him in the beer shop. Mr. White told me he was a-going to marry a heiress. He was, interjected Mr. Gorby, sapiently. He had only one friend as I ever saw, a Mr. Morland, who come ed air with him, and was a lays with him, brother-like. What is this Mr. Morland like? Good-looking enough, said Mrs. Hableton sourly, but his bits weren't as good as his face. Hansom is as Hansom does, is what I ses. I wonder if he knows anything about this affair, thought Gorby to himself. Where is Mr. Morland to be found? He asked. Not knowin', can't tell, retorted the landlady. He used to be air reg'lar, but I ain't seen him for over a week. Strange. Very, said Gorby, shaking his head. I should like to see this Mr. Morland. I suppose it's probable he'll call again? A bit bein' second nature, I suppose he will, answered the woman. He might call at any time. Mostly Avon called at night. Then I'll come down this evening on chance of seeing him, replied the detective. Coincidences happen in real life, as well as in novels, and the gentleman in question may turn up in the nick of time. Now, what else about Mr. White? About 2 weeks ago, or 3, I'm not certain which, if the gentleman called to see Mr. White. He was very tall, and wore a light coat. A morning coat? No, he was in evening dress, and wore a light coat over it, and a soft hat. The very man, said the detective below his breath. Go on. He went into Mr. White's room, and shut the door. I don't know how long they were talking together, but I was sitting in this very room and heard their voices get angry, and they were swearing at one another, which is the way with men, the brutes. I got up and went into the passage in order to ask him not to make such a noise, when Mr. White's door opens, and the gentleman in the light coat comes out and bangs along to the door. Mr. White, he comes to the door of his room, and he hollers out, She is mine. You can't do anything. And the other turns with his and on the door and says, I can kill you, and if you marry her I'll do it, even in the open street. Said Mr. Gorby, drawing a long breath, and then he bangs the door to, which it's never shut easy since, and I ain't got no money to get it put right, and Mr. White walks back to his room laughing. Did he make any remark to you? No. except he'd been worried by a lunatic. And what was the stranger's name? That I can't tell you, as Mr. White never told me. He was very tall, with a fair mustache, and dressed as I told you. Mr. Gorby was satisfied. That is the man, he said to himself, who got into the hansom cab and murdered White. There's no doubt of it. White and he were rivals for the heiress. What do I think of it? Said Mrs. Hableton curiously. I think, said Mr. Gorby slowly, with his eyes fixed on her, I think that there is a woman at the bottom of this crime. Chapter 6. Mr. Gorby makes further discoveries. When Mr. Gorby left Possum, villain no doubt remained in his mind as to who had committed the murder. The gentleman in the light coat had threatened to murder White, even in the open street, these last words being especially significant, and there was no doubt that he had carried out his threat. The committal of the crime was merely the fulfillment of the words uttered in anger. What the detective had now to do was to find who the gentleman in the light coat was, where he lived, and, that done, to ascertain his doings on the night of the murder. Mrs. Hableton had described him, but was ignorant of his name, and her very vague description might apply to dozens of young men in Melbourne. There was only one person who, in Mr. Gorby's opinion, could tell the name of the gentleman in the light coat, and that was Morland, the intimate friend of the dead man. They appeared, from the landlady's description, to have been so friendly that it was more than likely White would have told Morland all about his angry visitor. Besides, Morland's knowledge of his dead friend's life and habits might be able to supply information on 2 points, namely, who was most likely to gain by White's death, and who the heiress was that the deceased boasted he would marry. But the fact that Morland should be ignorant of his friend's tragic death, notwithstanding that the papers were full of it, and that the reward gave an excellent description of his personal appearance, greatly puzzled Gorby. The only way in which to account for Morland's extraordinary silence was that he was out of town, and had neither seen the papers nor heard anyone talking about the murder. If this were the case, he might either stay away for an indefinite time or return after a few days. At all events, it was worthwhile going down to St. Kilda in the evening on the chance that Morland might have returned to town and would call to see his friend. So, after his tea, Mr. Gorby put on his hat and went down to Possum Villa on what he could not help acknowledging to himself was a very slender possibility. Mrs. Hableton opened the door for him, and in silence led the way, not into her own sitting room, but into a much more luxuriously furnished apartment, which Gorby guessed at once was that of White's. He looked keenly round the room, and his estimate of the dead man's character was formed at once. Fast, he said to himself, and a spendthrift, a man who would have his friends, and possibly his enemies, among a very shady lot of people. What led Mr. Gorby to this belief was the evidence which surrounded him of White's mode of life. The room was well furnished, the furniture being covered with dark red velvet, while the curtains on the windows and the carpet were all of the same somewhat somber hue. I did the thing properly, observed Mrs. Hableton, with a satisfactory smile on her hard face. When you want young men to stop with you, the rooms must be well furnished, and Mr. White paid well, though he was rather particular about his food, which I'm only a plain cook, and can't make them French things which spile the stomach. The globes of the gas lamps were of a pale pink color, and Mrs. Hableton, having lit the gas in expectation of Mr. Gorby's arrival, there was a soft, roseate hue through the room. Mr. Gorby put his hands in his capacious pockets and strolled leisurely through the room, examining everything with a curious eye. The walls were covered with pictures of celebrated horses and famous jockeys. Alternating with these were photographs of ladies of the stage, mostly London actresses, Nellie Farren, Kate Vaughan, and other burlesque stars, evidently being the objects of the late Mr. White's adoration. Over the mantelpiece hung a rack of pipes, above which were 2 cross foils, and under these a number of plush frames of all colors, with pretty faces smiling out of them. A remarkable fact being that all the photographs were of ladies, and not a single male face was to be seen, either on the walls or in the plush frames. Fond of the ladies, I see, said Mr. Gorby, nodding his head towards the mantelpiece. A set of hussies, said Mrs. Hableton grimly, closing her lips tightly. I feel that ashamed when I dus am as never was. I don't believe in gals getting their pictures taken with hardly any clothes on, as if they just got out of bed, but Mr. White seems to like 'em. Most young men do, answered Mr. Gorby dryly, going over to the bookcase. Brutes, said the lady of the house. I'd drown 'em in the yar I would a set in, emselves and a callan, emselves lords of creation, as if women were made for nothing but to earn money and see 'em drink it as my usband did, which is inside never seemed to ave enough beer. And me a poor lone woman with no family. Thank God, where they'd ave taken arter their father in is drinking a bits. Mr. Gorby took no notice of this tirade against men, but stood looking at Mr. White's library, which seemed to consist mostly of French novels and sporting newspapers. Zola, said Mr. Gorby, thoughtfully, taking down a flimsy yellow book rather tattered. I've heard of him. If his novels are as bad as his reputation, I shouldn't care to read them. Here a knock came at the front door, loud and decisive. On hearing it, Mrs. Hableton sprang hastily to her feet. That may be Mr. Morland, she said, as the detective quickly replaced Zola in the bookcase. I never ave visitors in the evening, bein' a lone widder, and if it is, I'll bring him in air. She went out, and presently Gorby, who was listening intently, heard a man's voice ask if Mr. White was at home. No, sir, he ain't, answered the landlady, but there's a gentleman in his room skin after him. Won't you come in, sir? For a rest, yes, returned the visitor, and immediately afterwards Mrs. Hableton appeared, ushering in the late Oliver White's most intimate friend. He was a tall, slender man with a pink and white complexion, curly fair hair, and a drooping straw-colored mustache. Altogether a strikingly aristocratic individual. He was well dressed in a suit of check and had a cool, nonchalant air about him. And where is Mr. White tonight? He asked, sinking into a chair and taking no more notice of the detective than if he had been an article of furniture. Haven't you seen him lately? Asked the detective quickly. Mr. Morland stared in an insolent manner at his questioner for a few moments, as if he were debating the advisability of answering or not. At last he apparently decided that he would, for slowly pulling off one glove he leaned back in his chair. No, I have not, he said with a yawn. I have been up the country for a few days, and arrived back only this evening, so I have not seen him for over a week. Why do you ask? The detective did not answer, but stood looking at the young man before him in a thoughtful manner. I hope, said Mr. Morland, nonchalantly, I hope you will know me again, my friend, but I didn't know White had started a lunatic asylum during my absence. Who are you? Mr. Gorby came forward and stood under the gaslight. My name is Gorby, sir, and I am a detective, he said quietly. Ah, indeed, said Morland, coolly looking him up and down. What has White been doing? Running away with someone's wife? I know he has little weaknesses of that sort. Gorby shook his head. Do you know where Mr. White is to be found? He asked cautiously. Morland laughed. Not I, my friend, said he lightly. I presume he is somewhere about here, as these are his headquarters. What has he been doing? Nothing that can surprise me, I assure you. He was always an erratic individual, and... He paid Regler, interrupted Mrs. Hableton, pursing up her lips. A most enviable reputation to possess, answered the other with a sneer, and one I'm afraid I'll never enjoy. But why all this questioning about White? What's the matter with him? He's dead, said Gorby abruptly. All Morland's nonchalance vanished on hearing this, and he started up from his chair. Dead, he repeated mechanically. What do you mean? I mean that Mr. Oliver White was murdered in a hansom cab. Morland stared at the detective in a puzzled sort of way and passed his hand across his forehead. Excuse me, my head is in a whirl, he said as he sat down again. White murdered. He was all right when I left him nearly 2 weeks ago. Haven't you seen the papers? Asked Gorby. Not for the last 2 weeks, replied Morland. I have been up country, and it was only on arriving back in town tonight that I heard about the murder at all, as my landlady gave me a garbled account of it. But I never for a moment connected it with White, and I came down here to see him, as I had agreed to do when I left. Poor fellow, poor fellow, poor fellow, and much overcome, he buried his face in his hands. Mr. Gorby was touched by his evident distress, and even Mrs. Hableton permitted a small tear to roll down one hard cheek as a tribute of sorrow and sympathy. Presently Morland raised his head and spoke to Gorby in a husky tone. Tell me all about it, he said, leaning his cheek on his hand. Everything you know. He placed his elbows on the table and buried his face in his hands again, while the detective sat down and related all that he knew about White's murder. When it was done, he lifted up his head and looked sadly at the detective. "If I had been in town," he said, "this would not have happened, for I was always beside White." "You knew him very well, sir," said the detective in a sympathetic tone. "We were like brothers," replied Morland mournfully. "I came out from England in the same steamer with him, and used to visit him constantly here." Mrs. Hableton nodded her head to imply that such was the case. "In fact," said Mr. Morland, after a moment's thought, "I believe I was with him on the night he was murdered." Mrs. Hableton gave a slight scream and threw her apron over her face, but the detective sat unmoved, though Morland's last remark had startled him considerably. "What's the matter?" said Morland, turning to Mrs. Hableton. "Don't be afraid. I didn't kill him. No, but I met him last Thursday week, and I left for the country on Friday morning at 6:30. "And what time did you meet White on Thursday night?" asked Gorby. "Let me see," said Morland, crossing his legs and looking thoughtfully up to the ceiling. "It was about 9:30. I was in the Orient Hotel in Burke Street. We had a drink together, and then went up the street to an hotel in Russell Street where we had another. In fact," said Morland coolly, "we had several other drinks." "Brutes," muttered Mrs. Hableton, below her breath. "Yes," said Gorby, placidly. "Go on." "Well, it's hardly the thing to confess it," said Morland, looking from one to the other with a pleasant smile. "But in a case like this, I feel it my duty to throw all social scruples aside. We both became very drunk." "Ah, White was, as we know, drunk when he got into the cab. And you?" "I was not quite so bad as White," answered the other. "I have my senses about me. I fancy he left the hotel some minutes before 1 o'clock on Friday morning." "And what did you do?" "I remained in the hotel. He left his overcoat behind him, and I picked it up and followed him shortly afterwards to return it. I was too drunk to see in which direction he had gone, and stood leaning against the hotel door in Burke Street with the coat in my hand. Then someone came up and, snatching the coat from me, made off with it, and the last thing I remember was shouting out, 'Stop, thief!' Then I must have fallen down, for next morning I was in bed with all my clothes on, and they were very muddy. I got up and left town for the country by the 6:30 train, so I knew nothing about the matter until I came back to Melbourne tonight. That's all I know." "And you had no impression that White was watched that night?" "No, I had not," answered Morland frankly. "He was in pretty good spirits, though he was put out at first." "What was the cause of his being put out?" Morland arose, and going to a side table, brought White's album, which he laid on the table and opened in silence. The contents were very much the same as the photographs in the room, burlesque actresses and ladies of the ballet predominating. But Mr. Morland turned over the pages till nearly the end, when he stopped at a large cabinet photograph and pushed the album towards Mr. Gorby. "That was the cause," he said. "It was the portrait of a charmingly pretty girl, dressed in white, with a sailor hat on her fair hair, and holding a lawn tennis racket. She was bending half forward with a winning smile, and in the background bloomed a mass of tropical plants." Mrs. Hableton uttered a cry of surprise at seeing this. "Why, it's Miss Frettleby," she said. "How did he know her?" "Knew her father, letter of introduction, and all that sort of thing," said Mr. Morland glibly. "Ah, indeed," said Mr. Gorby slowly. "So Mr. White knew Mark Frettleby, the millionaire. But how did he obtain a photograph of the daughters?" "She gave it to him," said Morland. "The fact is, White was very much in love with Miss Frettleby." "And she was in love with someone else," finished Morland. "Exactly. Yes, she loved a Mr. Brian Fitzgerald, to whom she is now engaged. He was mad on her, and White and he used to quarrel desperately over the young lady." "Indeed," said Mr. Gorby. "And do you know this Mr. Fitzgerald?" "Oh dear, no," answered the other coolly. "White's friends were not mine. He was a rich young man who had good introductions. I am only a poor devil on the outskirts of society, trying to push my way in the world." "You are acquainted with his personal appearance, of course," observed Mr. Gorby. "Oh, yes, I can describe that," said Morland. "In fact, he's not at all unlike me, which I take to be rather a compliment, as he is said to be good-looking. He is tall, rather fair, talks in a bored sort of manner, and is altogether what one would call a heavy swell. But you must have seen him. he went on, turning to Mrs. Hableton. "He was here 3 or 4 weeks ago, White told me." "Oh, that was Mr. Fitzgerald, was it?" said Mrs. Hableton in surprise. "Yes, he is rather like you. The lady they quarreled over must have been Miss Frettleby." "Very likely," said Morland, rising. "Well, I'm off. Here's my address," putting a card in Gorby's hand. "I'm glad to be of any use to you in this matter, as White was my dearest friend, and I'll do all in my power to help you to find out the murderer." "I don't think that is a very difficult matter," said Mr. Gorby slowly. "Oh, you have your suspicions?" asked Morland, looking at him. "I have." "Then who do you think murdered White?" Mr. Gorby paused a moment, and then said deliberately, "I have an idea, but I am not certain. When I am certain, I'll speak." "You think Fitzgerald killed my friend," said Morland. "I see it in your face." Mr. Gorby smiled. "Perhaps," he said ambiguously. "Wait till I'm certain." Chapter 7. The Wool King. The old Greek legend of Midas turning everything he touched into gold is truer than most people imagine. Medieval superstition changed the human being who possessed such a power into the philosopher's stone, the stone which so many alchemists sought in the Dark Ages. But we of the 19th century have given back into human hands this power of transformation. But we do not ascribe it either to Greek deity or to superstition. We call it luck. And he who possesses luck should be happy, notwithstanding the proverb which hints the contrary. Luck means more than riches. It means happiness in most of those things which the fortunate possessor of it may choose to touch. Should he speculate, he is successful. If he marry, his wife will surely prove everything to be desired. Should he aspire to a position, social or political, he not only attains it, but does so with comparative ease. Worldly wealth, domestic happiness, high position, and complete success. All these things belong to the man who has luck. Mark Frettleby was one of these fortunate individuals, and his luck was proverbial throughout Australia. If there was any speculation for which Mark Frettleby went in, other men would surely follow, and in every case the result turned out as well, and in many cases even better than they expected. He had come out in the early days of the colony with comparatively little money, but his great perseverance and never-failing luck had soon changed his hundreds into thousands. And now at the age of 55, he did not himself know the extent of his income. He had large stations scattered all over the colony of Victoria, which brought him in a splendid income, a charming country house, where at certain seasons of the year he dispensed hospitality to his friends, and a magnificent townhouse down in St. Kilda, which would have been not unworthy of Park Lane. Nor were his domestic relations less happy. He had a charming wife, who was one of the best known and most popular ladies of Melbourne, and an equally charming daughter, who, being both pretty and an heiress, naturally attracted crowds of suitors. But Madge Frettleby was capricious and refused innumerable offers. Being an extremely independent young person with a mind of her own, she decided to remain single, as she had not yet seen anyone she could love, and with her mother continued to dispense the hospitality of the mansion at St. Kilda. But the fairy prince comes at length to every woman, and in this instance he came at his appointed time, in the person of one Brian Fitzgerald, a tall, handsome, fair-haired young man hailing from Ireland. He had left behind him in the old country a ruined castle and a few acres of barren land, inhabited by discontented tenants, who refused to pay the rent and talked darkly about the land league and other agreeable things. Under these circumstances, with no rent coming in and no prospect of doing anything in the future, Brian had left the castle of his forefathers to the rats and the family banshee and had come out to Australia to make his fortune. He brought letters of introduction to Mark Frettleby, and that gentleman, taking a fancy to him, assisted him by every means in his power. Under Frettleby's advice, Brian bought a station, and, to his astonishment, in a few years he found himself growing rich. The Fitzgeralds had always been more famous for spending than for saving, and it was an agreeable surprise to their latest representative to find the money rolling in instead of out. He began to indulge in castles in the air concerning that other castle in Ireland, with the barren acres and discontented tenants. In his mind's eye, he saw the old place rise up in all its pristine splendor from out its ruins. He saw the barren acres well cultivated, and the tenants happy and content. He was rather doubtful on this latter point, but with the rash confidence of 8 and 20, determined to do his best to perform even the impossible. Having built and furnished his castle in the air, Brian naturally thought of giving it a mistress, and this time actual appearance took the place of vision. He fell in love with Madge Frettleby, and having decided in his own mind that she and none other was fitted to grace the visionary halls of his renovated castle, he watched his opportunity and declared himself. She, womanlike, coquetted with him for some time, but at last, unable to withstand the impetuosity of her Irish lover, confessed in a low voice, with a pretty smile on her face, that she could not live without him. Whereupon, well, lovers being of a conservative turn of mind and accustomed to observe the traditional forms of wooing, the result can easily be guessed. Brian hunted all over the jewelers' shops in Melbourne with lover-like assiduity, and having obtained a ring wherein were set turquoise stones as blue as his own eyes, he placed it on her slender finger, and at last felt that his engagement was an accomplished fact. He next proceeded to interview the father, and had just screwed up his courage to the awful ordeal, when something occurred which postponed the interview indefinitely. Mrs. Frettleby was out driving, and the horses took fright and bolted. The coachman and groom both escaped unhurt, but Mrs. Frettleby was thrown out and killed instantly. This was the first really great trouble which had fallen on Mark Frettleby, and he seemed stunned by it. Shutting himself up in his room, he refused to see anyone, even his daughter, and appeared at the funeral with a white and haggard face, which shocked everyone. When everything was over, and the body of the late Mrs. Frettleby was consigned to the earth, with all the pomp and ceremony which money could give, the bereaved husband rode home and resumed his old life. But he was never the same again. His face, which had always been so genial and so bright, became stern and sad. He seldom smiled, and when he did, it was a faint wintry smile, which seemed mechanical. His whole interest in life was centered in his daughter. She became the sole mistress of the street Kilda mansion, and her father idolized her. She was apparently the one thing left to him which gave him a pleasure in existence. In truth, had it not been for her bright presence, Mark Frettleby would fain have been lying beside his dead wife in the quiet graveyard. After a time, Brian again resolved to ask Mr. Frettleby for the hand of his daughter. But for the second time, fate interposed. A rival suitor made his appearance, and Brian's hot Irish temper rose in anger at him. Mr. Oliver White had come out from England a few months previously, bringing with him a letter of introduction to Mr. Frettleby, who received him hospitably, as was his custom. Taking advantage of this, White lost no time in making himself perfectly at home in the street Kilda mansion. From the outset, Brian took a dislike to the newcomer. He was a student of Lavater and prided himself on his perspicuity in reading character. His opinion of White was anything but flattering to that gentleman, while Madge shared his repulsion towards the newcomer. On his part, Mr. White was nothing if not diplomatic. He affected not to notice the coldness of Madge's reception of him. On the contrary, he began to pay her the most marked attentions, much to Brian's disgust. At length he asked her to be his wife, and notwithstanding her prompt refusal, spoke to her father on the subject. Much to the astonishment of his daughter, Mr. Frettleby not only consented to White paying his addresses to Madge, but gave that young lady to understand that he wished her to consider his proposals favorably. In spite of all Madge could say, he refused to alter his decision, and White, feeling himself safe, began to treat Brian with an insolence which was highly galling to Fitzgerald's proud nature. He had called on White at his lodgings, and after a violent quarrel, he had left the house vowing to kill him, should he marry Madge Frettleby. The same night, Fitzgerald had an interview with Mr. Frettleby. He confessed that he loved Madge, and that his love was returned. So, when Madge added her entreaties to Brian's, Mr. Frettleby found himself unable to withstand the combined forces, and gave his consent to their engagement. White was absent in the country for the next few days after his stormy interview with Brian, and it was only on his return that he learnt that Madge was engaged to his rival. He saw Mr. Frettleby, and having learnt from his own lips that such was the case, he left the house at once, and swore that he would never enter it again. He little knew how prophetic were his words, for on that same night he met his death in the Hansom Cab. He had passed out of the life of both the lovers, and they, glad that he troubled them no more, never suspected for a moment that the body of the unknown man found in Royston's cab was that of Oliver White. About 2 weeks after White's disappearance, Mr. Frettleby gave a dinner party in honor of his daughter's birthday. It was a delightful evening, and the wide French windows which led onto the veranda were open, letting in a gentle breeze from the ocean. Outside there was a kind of screen of tropical plants, and through the tangle of the boughs the guests, seated at the table, could just see the waters of the bay glittering in the pale moonlight. Brian was seated opposite to Madge, and every now and then he caught a glimpse of her bright face from behind the fruit and flowers, which stood in the center of the table. Mark Frettleby was at the head of the table and appeared in very good spirits. His stern features were somewhat relaxed, and he drank more wine than usual. The soup had just been removed when someone, who was late, entered with apologies and took his seat. Someone in this case was Mr. Felix Ralston, one of the best-known young men in Melbourne. He had an income of his own, scribbled a little for the papers, was to be seen at every house of any pretensions in Melbourne, and was always bright, happy, and full of news. For details of any scandal you were safe in applying to Felix Ralston. He knew all that was going on, both at home and abroad, and his knowledge, if not very accurate, was at least extensive, while his conversation was piquant, and at times witty. Carlton, one of the leading lawyers of the city, remarked that Ralston put him in mind of what Beaconsfield said of one of the personages in Lothair. He wasn't an intellectual Croesus, but his pockets were always full of sixpences. Be it said in his favor that Felix was free with his sixpences. The conversation, which had shown signs of languishing before his arrival, now brightened up. "So awfully sorry, don't you know," said Felix, as he slipped into a seat by Madge, "but a fellow like me has got to be careful of his time. So many calls on it." "So many calls in it, you mean?" retorted Madge, with a disbelieving smile. "Confess, now, you have been paying a round of visits." "Well, yes," assented Mr. Ralston. "That's the disadvantage of having a large circle of acquaintances. They give you weak tea and thin bread and butter, whereas—" "You would rather have something else," finished Brian. There was a laugh at this, but Mr. Ralston disdained to notice the interruption. "The only advantage of 5 o'clock tea," he went on, "is that it brings people together, and one hears what's going on." "Ah, yes, Ralston," said Mr. Frettleby, who was looking at him with an amused smile. "What news have you?" "Good news, bad news, and such news as you have never heard of," quoted Ralston gravely. "Yes, I have a bit of news. Haven't you heard it?" Ralston felt he held sensation in his hands. There was nothing he liked better. "Well, do you know," he said, gravely fixing in his eyeglass, "they have found out the name of the fellow who was murdered in the Hansom Cab." "Never!" cried everyone eagerly. "Yes," went on Ralston, "and what's more, you all know him." "It's never White," said Brian, in a horrified tone. "Hang it! How did you know?" said Ralston, rather annoyed at being forestalled. "Why, I just heard it at the St. Kilda station." "Oh, easily enough," said Brian, rather confused. "I used to meet White constantly, and as I have not seen him for the last 2 weeks, I thought he might be the victim." "How did they find out?" asked Mr. Frettleby, idly toying with his wineglass. "Oh, one of those detective fellows, you know," answered Felix. "They know everything." "I'm sorry to hear it," said Frettleby, referring to the fact that White was murdered. "He had a letter of introduction to me, and seemed a clever, pushing young fellow." "A confounded cad," muttered Felix under his breath, and Brian, who overheard him, seemed inclined to assent. For the rest of the meal, nothing was talked about but the murder and the mystery in which it was shrouded. When the ladies retired, they chatted about it in the drawing-room, but finally dropped it for more agreeable subjects. The men, however, when the cloth was removed, filled their glasses, and continued the discussion with unabated vigor. Brian alone did not take part in the conversation. He sat moodily staring at his untasted wine, wrapped in a brown study. "What I can't make out," observed Ralston, who was amusing himself with cracking nuts, "is why they did not find out who he was before." "That is not hard to answer," said Frettleby, filling his glass. He was comparatively little known here, as he had been out from England such a short time, and I fancy that this was the only house at which he visited. "And look here, Ralston," said Carlton, who was sitting near him, If you were to find a man dead in a hansom cab, dressed in evening clothes, which 9 men out of 10 are in the habit of wearing in the evening, no cards in his pockets, and no name on his linen, I rather think you would find it hard to discover who he was. I consider it reflects great credit on the police for finding out so quickly. Puts one in mind of the Leavenworth case, and all that sort of thing, said Felix, whose reading was of the lightest description. Awfully exciting, like putting a Chinese puzzle together. Gad, I wouldn't mind being a detective myself. I'm afraid if that were the case, said Mr. Frettleby, with an amused smile, criminals would be pretty safe. Oh, I don't know so much about that, answered Felix, shrewdly. Some fellows are like trifle at a party, froth on top, but something better underneath. What a greedy simile, said Carlton, sipping his wine. But I'm afraid the police will have a more difficult task in discovering the man who committed the crime. In my opinion, he's a deuced clever fellow. Then you don't think he will be discovered? Asked Brian, rousing himself out of his brown study. Well, I don't go as far as that, rejoined Carlton, but he has certainly left no trace behind him, and even the Red Indian, in whom instinct for tracking is so highly developed, needs some sort of a trail to enable him to find out his enemies. Depend upon it, went on Carlton, warming to his subject, the man who murdered White is no ordinary criminal. The place he chose for the committal of the crime was such a safe one. Do you think so? Said Ralston. Why? I should think that a hansom cab in a public street would be very unsafe. It is that very fact that makes it safer, replied Mr. Carlton epigrammatically. You read De Quincey's account of the Marr murders in London, and you will see that the more public the place, the less risk there is of detection. There was nothing about the gentleman in the light coat who murdered White to excite Royston's suspicions. He entered the cab with White. No noise or anything likely to attract attention was heard, and then he alighted. Naturally enough, Royston drove to St. Kilda, and never suspected White was dead till he looked inside and touched him. As to the man in the light coat, he doesn't live in Powlett Street. No, nor in East Melbourne either. Why not? Asked Frettleby. Because he wouldn't have been such a fool as to leave a trail to his own door. He did what the fox often does, he doubled. My opinion is that he went either right through East Melbourne to Fitzroy, or he walked back through the Fitzroy Gardens into town. There was no one about at that time of the morning, and he could return to his lodgings, hotel, or wherever he is staying, with impunity. Of course, this is a theory that may be wrong, but from what insight into human nature my profession has given me, I think that my idea is a correct one. All present agreed with Mr. Carlton's idea, as it really did seem the most natural thing that would be done by a man desirous of escaping detection. Tell you what, said Felix to Brian, as they were on their way to the drawing-room. If the fellow that committed the crime is found out, by gad, he ought to get Carlton to defend him. Chapter 8. Brian takes a walk and a drive. When the gentleman entered the drawing-room, a young lady was engaged in playing one of those detestable pieces of the morceau salon order, in which an unoffending air is taken, and variations embroidered on it, till it becomes a perfect agony to distinguish the tune, amid the perpetual rattle of quavers and demi-semi-quavers. The melody in this case was Over the Garden Wall, with variations by Signor Thumpanini, and the young lady who played it was a pupil of that celebrated Italian musician. When the male portion of the guests entered, the air was being played in the bass with a great deal of power. That is, the loud pedal was down, and with a perpetual rattle of treble notes, trying with all their shrill might to drown the tune. Gad! It's getting over the garden wall in a hailstorm, said Felix, as he strolled over to the piano, for he saw that the musician was Dora Featherweight, an heiress to whom he was then paying attention, in the hope that she might be induced to take the name of Ralston. So, when the fair Dora had paralyzed her audience with one final bang and rattle, as if the gentleman going over the garden wall had tumbled into the cucumber frame, Felix was loud in his expressions of delight. Such power, you know, Miss Featherweight, he said, sinking into a chair and mentally wondering if any of the piano strings had given way at that last crash. You put your heart into it, and all your muscle, too, by gad, he added mentally. It's nothing but practice, answered Miss Featherweight with a modest blush. I'm at the piano 4 hours every day. Good heavens, thought Felix, what a time the family must have of it. But he kept this remark to himself, and, screwing his eyeglass into his left organ of vision, merely ejaculated, "Lucky piano." Miss Featherweight, not being able to think of any answer to this, looked down and blushed, while the ingenuous Felix looked up and sighed. Madge and Brian were in a corner of the room, talking over White's death. "I never liked him," she said, "but it is horrible to think of him dying like that." "I don't know," answered Brian, gloomily. "From all I can hear, dying by chloroform is a very easy death." "Death can never be easy," replied Madge, "especially to a young man so full of health and spirits as Mr. White was." "I believe you are sorry he's dead," said Brian jealously. "Aren't you?" she asked in some surprise. "De mortuis nil nisi bonum," quoted Fitzgerald. "But as I detested him when alive, you can't expect me to regret his end." Madge did not answer him, but glanced quickly at his face, and for the first time it struck her that he looked ill. "What is the matter with you, dear?" she asked, placing her hand on his arm. "You are not looking well." "Nothing, nothing," he answered hurriedly. "I've been a little worried about business lately. But come," he said, rising, "let us go outside, for I see your father has got that girl with the steam whistle voice to sing." The girl with the steam whistle voice was Julia Featherweight, the sister of Ralston's inamorata, and Madge stifled a laugh as she went onto the veranda with Fitzgerald. "What a shame of you," she said, bursting into a laugh when they were safely outside. "She's been taught by the best masters." "How I pity them," retorted Brian, grimly, as Julia wailed out, "Meet me once again," with an ear-piercing shrillness. "I'd much rather listen to our ancestral banshee. And as to meeting her again, one interview would be more than enough." Madge did not answer, but leaning lightly over the high rail of the veranda, looked out into the beautiful moonlit night. There were a number of people passing along the esplanade, some of whom stopped and listened to Julia's shrill notes. One man in particular seemed to have a taste for music, for he persistently stared over the fence at the house. Brian and Madge talked of diverse subjects, but every time Madge looked up, she saw the man watching the house. "What does that man want, Brian?" she asked. "What man?" asked Brian, starting. "Oh," he went on indifferently, as the watcher moved away from the gate and crossed the road onto the footpath. "He's taken up with the music, I suppose. That's all." Madge said nothing, but she could not help thinking there was more in it than the music. Presently Julia ceased, and she proposed to go in. "Why?" asked Brian, who was lying back in a comfortable seat, smoking a cigarette. "It's nice enough here. I must attend to my guests," she answered, rising. "You stop here and finish your cigarette," and with a gay laugh, she flitted into the house. Brian sat and smoked, staring out into the moonlight the while. Yes, the man was certainly watching the house, for he sat on one of the seats and kept his eyes fixed on the brilliantly lighted windows. Brian threw away his cigarette and shivered slightly. "Could anyone have seen me?" he muttered, rising uneasily. "Pshaw, of course not. And the cabman would never recognize me again. Curse White, I wish I'd never set eyes upon him." He gave one glance at the dark figure on the seat, and then, with a shiver, passed into the warm, well-lighted room. He did not feel easy in his mind, and he would have felt still less, so had he known that the man on the seat was one of the cleverest of the Melbourne detectives. Mr. Gorby had been watching the Frettleby mansion the whole evening, and was getting rather annoyed. Morland did not know where Fitzgerald lived, and as that was one of the primary facts the detective wished to ascertain, he determined to watch Brian's movements and to trace him home. "If he's the lover of that pretty girl, I'll wait till he leaves the house," argued Mr. Gorby to himself, as he took his seat on the esplanade. "He won't long remain away from her, and once he leaves the house, it will be no difficult matter to find out where he lives." When Brian made his appearance early in the evening, on his way to Mark Frettleby's mansion, he wore evening dress, a light overcoat, and a soft hat. "Well, I'm dashed," ejaculated Mr. Gorby when he saw Fitzgerald disappear. "If he isn't a fool, I don't know who is, to go about in the very clothes he wore when he polished White off and think he won't be recognized. Melbourne ain't Paris or London, that he can afford to be so careless, and when I put the darbies on him, he will be astonished. Ah, well," he went on, lighting his pipe and taking a seat on the esplanade, "I suppose I'll have to wait here till he comes out." Mr. Gorby's patience was pretty severely tried, for hour after hour passed, and no one appeared. He smoked several pipes, and watched the people strolling along in the soft silver moonlight. A bevy of girls passed by with their arms round one another's waists. Then a young man and woman, evidently lovers, came walking along. They sat down by Mr. Gorby and looked hard at him, to hint that he need not stay. But the detective took no heed of them, and kept his eyes steadily upon the great house opposite. Finally, the lovers took themselves off with a very bad grace. Then Mr. Gorby saw Madge and Brian come out onto the veranda, and heard in the stillness of the night a sound weird and unearthly. It was Miss Featherweight singing. He saw Madge go in, shortly followed by Brian. The latter turned and stared at him for a moment. "Ah," said Gorby to himself as he relit his pipe, "your conscience is smiting you, is it? Wait a bit, my boy, till I have you in jail." Then the guests came out of the house, and their black figures disappeared one by one from the moonlight as they shook hands and said good night. Shortly after, Brian came down the path with Frettleby at his side, and Madge hanging on her father's arm. Frettleby opened the gate and held out his hand. "Good night, Fitzgerald," he said in a hearty voice. "Come soon again." "Good night, Brian, dearest," said Madge, kissing him, "and don't forget tomorrow." Then father and daughter closed the gate, leaving Brian outside, and walked back to the house. "Ah," said Mr. Gorby to himself, "if you only knew what I know, you wouldn't be so precious kind to him." Brian strolled along the Esplanade and, crossing over, passed by Gorby and walked on till he was opposite the Esplanade Hotel. Then he leaned his arms on the fence and, taking off his hat, enjoyed the calm beauty of the hour. "What a good-looking fellow," murmured Mr. Gorby in a regretful tone. "I can hardly believe it of him, but the proofs are too clear." The night was perfectly still. Not a breath of wind stirred, for what breeze there had been had long since died away. But Brian could see the white wavelets breaking lightly on the sands. The long, narrow pier ran out like a black thread into the sheet of gleaming silver, and away in the distance the line of the Williamstown lights sparkled like some fairy illumination. Over all this placid scene of land and water was a sky such as Doyle loved, a great heavy mass of rain clouds heaped one on top of the other, as the rocks the Titans piled to reach Olympus. Then a break in the woof, and a bit of dark blue sky could be seen glittering with stars, in the midst of which sailed the serene moon, shedding down her light on the cloudland beneath, giving to it all one silver lining. Somewhat to the annoyance of Mr. Gorby, who had no eye for the picturesque, Brian gazed at the sky for several minutes, admiring the wonderful beauty of its broken masses of light and shade. At length he lit a cigarette and walked down the steps onto the pier. "Oh, suicide, is it?" muttered Mr. Gorby. "Not if I can help it." And he lit his pipe and followed him. He found Brian leaning over the parapet at the end of the pier, looking at the glittering waters beneath, which kept rising and falling in a dreamy rhythm that soothed and charmed the ear. "Poor girl! Poor girl!" the detective heard him mutter as he came up. "If she only knew all! If she—" At this moment he heard the approaching step and turned round sharply. The detective saw that his face was ghastly pale in the moonlight, and his brows wrinkled in anger. "What the devil do you want?" he burst out as Gorby paused. "What do you mean by following me all over the place?" "Saw me watching the house," said Gorby to himself. "I'm not following you, sir," he said aloud. "I suppose the pier ain't private property. I only came down here for a breath of fresh air." Fitzgerald did not answer, but turned sharply on his heel and walked quickly up the pier, leaving Gorby staring after him. "He's getting frightened," soliloquized the detective to himself, as he strolled easily along, keeping the black figure in front well in view. "I'll have to keep a sharp eye on him, or he'll be clearing out of Victoria." Brian walked rapidly up to the Street Kilda station, for on looking at his watch he found that he would just have time to catch the last train. He arrived a few minutes before it started, so, getting into the smoking carriage at the near end of the platform, he lit a cigarette and, leaning back in his seat, watched the late-comers hurrying into the station. Just as the last bell rang, he saw a man rush along to catch the train. It was the same man who had been watching him the whole evening, and Brian felt confident that he was being followed. He comforted himself, however, with the thought that this pertinacious follower might lose the train, and, being in the last carriage himself, he kept a lookout along the platform, expecting to see his friend of the Esplanade standing disappointed on it. There was no appearance of him, so Brian, sinking back into his seat, lamented his ill luck in not shaking off this man who kept him under such strict surveillance. "Confound him," he muttered softly. "I expect he will follow me to East Melbourne and find out where I live, but he shan't if I can help it." There was no one but himself in the carriage, and he felt relieved at this because he was in no humor to hear chatter. "Murdered in a cab," he said, lighting a fresh cigarette and blowing a cloud of smoke. "A romance in real life, which beats Miss Braddon Hollow. There is one thing certain. He won't come between Madge and me again." Poor Madge, with an impatient sigh. "If she only knew all, there would not be much chance of our marriage. But she can never find out, and I don't suppose anyone else will." Here a thought suddenly struck him, and rising out of his seat, he walked to the other end of the carriage and threw himself on the cushions, as if desirous to escape from himself. "What grounds can that man have for suspecting me?" he said aloud. "No one knows I was with White on that night, and the police can't possibly bring forward any evidence to show that I was. Pshaw," he went on, impatiently buttoning up his coat. "I am like a child, afraid of my shadow. The fellow on the pier is only someone out for a breath of fresh air. As he said himself, I am quite safe." At the same time, he felt by no means easy in his mind, and as he stepped out onto the platform at the Melbourne station, he looked round apprehensively, as if he half expected to feel the detective's hand upon his shoulder. But he saw no one at all like the man he had met on the St. Kilda pier, and with a sigh of relief he left the station. Mr. Gorby, however, was not far away. He was following at a safe distance. Brian walked slowly along Flinders Street, apparently deep in thought. He turned up Russell Street and did not stop until he found himself close to the Burke and Wills Monument, the exact spot where the cab had stopped on the night of White's murder. "Ah," said the detective to himself, as he stood in the shadow on the opposite side of the street. "You're going to have a look at it, are you?" "I wouldn't if I were you. It's dangerous." Fitzgerald stood for a few minutes at the corner and then walked up Collins Street. When he got to the cab stand opposite the Melbourne Club, still suspecting he was followed, he hailed a hansom and drove away in the direction of Spring Street. Gorby was rather perplexed at this sudden move, but without delay, he hailed another cab and told the driver to follow the first till it stopped. "Two can play at that game," he said, settling himself back in the cab, "and I'll get the better of you. Clever as you are, and you are clever," he went on in a tone of admiration as he looked round the luxurious hansom. "To choose such a convenient place for a murder. No disturbance and plenty of time for escape after you had finished. It's a pleasure going after a chap like you, instead of after men who tumble down like ripe fruit and ain't got any brains to keep their crime quiet." While the detective thus soliloquized, his cab, following on the trail of the other, had turned down Spring Street and was being driven rapidly along the Wellington Parade in the direction of East Melbourne. It then turned up Powlett Street, at which Mr. Gorby was glad. "Ain't so clever as I thought," he said to himself. "Shows his nest right off, without any attempt to hide it." The detective, however, had reckoned without his host, for the cab in front kept driving on, through an interminable maze of streets, until it seemed as though Brian were determined to drive the whole night. "Look there, sir," cried Gorby's cabman, looking through his trapdoor in the roof of the hansom. "How long's this ere game a-going to larst? Mine OSS is knocked up. 'E is, and his blessed old legs is agivin' way under I'm—" "Go on, go on," answered the detective impatiently. "I'll pay you well." The cabman's spirits were raised by this, and by dint of coaxing and a liberal use of the whip, he managed to get his jaded horse up to a pretty good pace. They were in Fitzroy by this time, and both cabs turned out of Gertrude Street into Nicholson Street, thence passed on to Evelyn Street and along Spring Street, until Brian's cab stopped at the corner of Collins Street, and Gorby saw him alight and dismiss his cabman. He then walked down the street and disappeared into the Treasury Gardens. "Confound it," said the detective, as he got out and paid his fare, which was by no means a light one, but over which he had no time to argue. "We've come in a circle, and I do believe he lives in Powlett Street after all." He went into the gardens and saw Brian some distance ahead of him, walking rapidly. It was bright moonlight, and he could easily distinguish Fitzgerald by his light coat. As he went along that noble avenue with its elms in their winter dress, the moon shining through their branches wrought a fantastic tracery on the smooth asphalt. And on either side Gorby could see the dim, white forms of the old Greek gods and goddesses. Venus Victrix, with the apple in her hand, which Mr. Gorby, in his happy ignorance of heathen mythology, took for Eve offering Adam the forbidden fruit, Diana, with the hound at her feet, and Bacchus and Ariadne, which the detective imagined were the babes in the wood. He knew that each of the statues had queer names, but thought they were merely allegorical. Passing over the bridge, with the water rippling quietly underneath, Brian went up the smooth yellow path to where the statue of Hebe, holding the cup, seems instinct with life. And turning down the path to the right, he left the gardens by the end gate, near which stands the statue of the dancing faun, with the great bush of scarlet geranium burning like an altar before it. Then he went along the Wellington Parade and turned up Powlett Street, where he stopped at a house near Cairns Memorial Church, much to Mr. Gorby's relief, who, being like Hamlet, fat and scant of breath, found himself rather exhausted. He kept well in the shadow, however, and saw Fitzgerald give one final look round before he disappeared into the house. Then Mr. Gorby, like the robber captain in Ali Baba, took careful stock of the house and fixed its locality and appearance well in his mind, as he intended to call at it on the morrow. "What I'm going to do," he said, as he walked slowly back to Melbourne, "is to see his landlady when he's out and find out what time he came in on the night of the murder. If it fits into the time he got out of Rankin's cab, I'll get out a warrant and arrest him straight off." Chapter 9. Mr. Gorby is satisfied at last. In spite of his long walk and still longer drive, Brian did not sleep well that night. He kept tossing and turning, or lying on his back, wide awake, looking into the darkness and thinking of White. Towards dawn, when the first faint glimmer of morning came through the Venetian blinds, he fell into a sort of uneasy doze, haunted by horrible dreams. He thought he was driving in a hansom, when suddenly he found White by his side, clad in white cerements, grinning and gibbering at him with ghastly merriment. Then the cab went over a precipice, and he fell from a great height, down, with the mocking laughter still sounding in his ears, until he woke with a loud cry, and found it was broad daylight, and that drops of perspiration were standing on his brow. It was no use trying to sleep any longer, so with a weary sigh, he arose and went to his tub, feeling jaded and worn out by worry and want of sleep. His bath did him some good. The cold water brightened him up and pulled him together. Still, he could not help giving a start of surprise when he saw his face reflected in the mirror, old and haggard-looking, with dark circles round the eyes. "A pleasant life I'll have of it if this sort of thing goes on," he said bitterly. "I wish I had never seen or heard of White." He dressed himself carefully. He was not a man to neglect his toilet, however worried and out of sorts he might happen to feel. Yet, notwithstanding all his efforts, the change in his appearance did not escape the eye of his landlady. She was a small, dried-up little woman with a wrinkled, yellowish face. She seemed parched up and brittle. Whenever she moved, she crackled, and one went in constant dread of seeing a wizen-looking limb break off short like the branch of some dead tree. When she spoke, it was in a voice hard and shrill, not unlike the chirp of a cricket. When, as was frequently the case, she clothed her attenuated form in a faded brown silk gown, her resemblance to that lively insect was remarkable. And, as on this morning she crackled into Brian's sitting room with the Argus and his coffee, a look of dismay at his altered appearance came over her stony little countenance. "Dear me, sir," she chirped out in her shrill voice, as she placed her burden on the table, "are you took bad?" Brian shook his head. "Want of sleep, that's all, Mrs. Sampson," he answered, unfolding the Argus. "Ah, that's because ye ain't got enough blood in yourity," said Mrs. Sampson, wisely, for she had her own ideas on the subject of health. "If you ain't got blood, you ain't got sleep." Brian looked at her as she said this, for there seemed such an obvious want of blood in her veins that he wondered if she had ever slept in all her life. "There was my father's brother, which, of course, makes him my uncle," went on the landlady, pouring out a cup of coffee for Brian. "And the blood he 'ad was something astounding, which it made him sleep that long as they 'ad to draw pints from him afore Edie wake in the morning." Brian had the Argus before his face, and under its friendly cover he laughed quietly to himself. His blood poured out like a river, went on the landlady, still drawing from the rich stores of her imagination. And the doctor was struck dumb with astonishment at seeing the niggerer which burst from him. But I'm not so full-blooded myself. Fitzgerald again stifled a laugh, and wondered that Mrs. Sampson was not afraid of being treated as were Ananias and Sapphira. However, he said nothing, but merely intimated that if she would leave the room, he would take his breakfast. "And if you want anything else, Mr. Fitzgerald," she said, going to the door, "you knows your way to the bell as easily as I do to the kitchen." And with a final chirrup, she crackled out of the room. As soon as the door was closed, Brian put down his paper and roared, in spite of his worries. He had that extraordinary, vivacious Irish temperament, which enables a man to put all trouble behind his back and thoroughly enjoy the present. His landlady, with her Arabian night-like romances, was a source of great amusement to him, and he felt considerably cheered by the odd turn her humor had taken this morning. After a time, however, his laughter ceased, and his troubles came crowding on him again. He drank his coffee, but pushed away the food which was before him, and looked through the Argus for the latest report about the murder case. What he read made his cheek turn a shade paler than before. He could feel his heart thumping wildly. "They found a clue, have they?" he muttered, rising and pacing restlessly up and down. "I wonder what it can be? I threw that man off the scent last night, but if he suspects me, there will be no difficulty in his finding out where I live. Bah! What nonsense I am talking. I am the victim of my own morbid imagination. There is nothing to connect me with the crime, so I need not be afraid of my shadow. I've a good mind to leave town for a time, but if I am suspected, that would excite suspicion. Oh, Madge, my darling," he cried passionately, "if you only knew what I suffer, I know that you would pity me. But you must never know the truth. Never, never." And sinking into a chair by the window, he covered his face with his hands. After remaining in this position for some minutes, occupied with his own gloomy thoughts, he arose and rang the bell. A faint crackle in the distance announced that Mrs. Sampson had heard it, and she soon came into the room, looking more like a cricket than ever. Brian had gone into his bedroom, and called out to her from there. "I am going down to St. Kilda, Mrs. Sampson," he said, "and probably I shall not be back all day." "Which I 'opes it you'll do you good," she answered, "for you've eaten nothing, and the sea breezes is miraculous for making you take to your victuals. My mother's brother, being a sailor, and wonderful for his stomach, which when he had done a meal, the table looked as if a locust had gone over it." "And what?" asked Fitzgerald, buttoning his gloves. "A locust," replied the landlady, in surprise at his ignorance, "as I've read in 'Oly Writ, as how John the Baptist was partial to him. Not that I think they be very fillin', though, to be sure, he had a sweet tooth, and ate only with them." "Oh, you mean locusts," said Brian, now enlightened. "And what else?" asked Mrs. Sampson indignantly, "which though not being a scholard, I speaks English, I 'opes. My mother's second cousin, Avon, at first prize at a spellin' bee, though he died early through brain fever. Avon crowded is he overmuch with the dictionary." "Dear me," answered Brian mechanically. "How unfortunate!" He was not listening to Mrs. Sampson's remarks. He suddenly remembered an arrangement which Madge had made, and which up till now had slipped his memory. "Mrs. Sampson," he said, turning round at the door, "I am going to bring Mr. Frettleby and his daughter to have a cup of afternoon tea here, so you might have some ready." "You ave only to ask and to ave," answered Mrs. Sampson, hospitably, with a gratified crackle of all her joints. "I'll make the tea, sir, and also some of my own particular cakes, being a special kind I ave, which my mother showed me how to make. Avon been taught by a lady as she nussed through the scarlet fever, though being of a weak constitution, she died soon arter being into the bit of contracting any disease she might chance on." Brian hurried off, lest in her pole-like appreciation of them, Mrs. Sampson should give vent to more charnel house horrors. At one period of her life, the little woman had been a nurse, and it was told of her that she had frightened one of her patients into convulsions during the night by narrating to her the history of all the corpses she had laid out. This ghoul-like tendency, in the end, proved fatal to her professional advancement. As soon as Fitzgerald had gone, she went over to the window and watched him as he walked slowly down the street, a tall, handsome man, of whom any woman would be proud. What an awful thing it are to think he'll be a corpse some day, she chirped cheerily to herself. Though of course being a great swell in his own place, he'll have a nice airy vault, which you'd be far more comfortable than a close, stuffy grave, even though it has a tombstone and 6 lets over it. Ah now, who are you, impertinence? She broke off, as a stout man in a light suit of clothes crossed the road and rang the bell, pulling at the bell as if it were a pump handle. As the gentleman at the door, who was none other than Mr. Gorby, did not hear her, he of course did not reply, so she hurried down the stairs, crackling with anger at the rough usage her bell had received. Mr. Gorby had seen Brian go out, and deeming it a good opportunity for inquiry had lost no time in making a start. "You nearly tore the bell down," said Mrs. Sampson, as she presented her thin body and wrinkled face to the view of the detective. "I'm very sorry," answered Gorby meekly. "I'll knock next time." "Oh, no you won't," said the landlady, tossing her head. "Me not even a knocker, and you're scratching the paint off the door, which it ain't been done over 6 months by my sister-in-law's cousin, which he is a painter with a shop in Fitzroy, and a wonderful height of color." "Does Mr. Fitzgerald live here?" asked Mr. Gorby quietly. "He do," replied Mrs. Sampson, "but he's gone out, and won't be back till the arternoon, which any message you'll be delivered to him punctual on his arrival." "I'm glad he's not in," said Mr. Gorby. "Would you allow me to have a few moments' conversation?" "What is it?" asked the landlady, her curiosity being roused. "I'll tell you when we get inside," answered Mr. Gorby. She looked at him with her sharp little eyes, and seeing nothing disreputable about him, led the way upstairs, crackling loudly the whole time. This so astonished Mr. Gorby that he cast about in his own mind for an explanation of the phenomenon. "Wants oiling about the gents," was his conclusion, "but I never heard anything like it, and she looks as if she'd snap in two. She's that brittle." Mrs. Sampson took Gorby into Brian's sitting room, and having closed the door, sat down and prepared to hear what he had to say for himself. "I hope it ain't bills," she said. "Mr. Fitzgerald aven money in the bank, and everything respectable like a gentleman as he is, though, to be sure, your bill might come down on him unbeknown. He not aven kept it in mind, which it ain't everybody as ave such a good memory as my aunt on my mother's side. She aven been famous for dates like a history, not to speak of her multiplication tables and the numbers of people's oozes." "It's not bills," answered Mr. Gorby, who, having vainly attempted to stem the shrill torrent of words, had given in and waited mildly until she had finished. "I only want to know a few things about Mr. Fitzgerald's habits." "And what for?" asked Mrs. Sampson indignantly. "Are you a newspaper putting in articles about people who don't want to see themselves in print, which I knows you're to bits? My late husband aven been a printer on a paper which bust up, not aven the money to pay wages, through which there was due to him the sum of £1 7 and 6 halfpenny, which I bein is widder ought to ave. Not that I expects to see it on this side of the grave. Oh dear no." And she gave a shrill, elfish laugh. Mr. Gorby, seeing that unless he took the bull by the horns, he would never be able to get what he wanted, grew desperate and plunged in medias res. "I am an insurance agent," he said rapidly, so as to prevent any interruption, "and Mr. Fitzgerald desires to insure his life in our company. I, therefore, want to find out if he is a good life to insure. Does he live temperately, keep early hours, and, in fact, all about him?" "I shall be happy to answer any inquiries which may be of use to you, sir," replied Mrs. Sampson, "knowing, as I do, how good insurance is to a family, should the of it be taken off unexpected, leaving a widder, which, as I know, Mr. Fitzgerald is a-going to be married soon, and I hopes he'll be happy, though through what I loses a lodger as a lays paid reg'lar, and behaved like a gentleman." "So he is a temperate man," said Mr. Gorby, feeling his way cautiously. "Not being a blue ribbing all the same," answered Mrs. Sampson, "and I never saw him the wuss for drink. He being a lays able to use his latchkey, and take his boots off afore going to bed, which is no more than a woman ought to expect from a lodger. She aven to do her own washing, and he keeps good hours?" "A lays in afore the clock strikes 12, answered the landlady, "though to be sure, I uses it as a figure of speech. None of the clocks in the booze striking but one, which is bein' mended, aven broke through overwinded." "Is he always in before 12? asked Mr. Gorby, keenly disappointed at this answer. Mrs. Sampson eyed him waggishly, and a smile crept over her wrinkled little face. "Young men not be old men," she replied cautiously, "and sinners not be saints. It's not natural as latchkeys should be made for ornament instead of use. And Mr. Fitzgerald bein' one of the handsomest men in Melbourne, it ain't to be expected as he should let his latchkey get rusty, though, even a good moral character, he uses it with moderation. But I suppose you are seldom awake when he comes in really late," said the detective. "Not as a rule," assented Mrs. Sampson, "bein' a heavy sleeper and much disposed for bed, but I ave heard him comin' arter 12, the last time bein' Thursday week." "Ah!" Mr. Gorby drew a long breath. For Thursday week was the night upon which the murder was committed. "Bein' troubled with my," said Mrs. Sampson, "through, havin' been out in the sun all day washing. I did not feel so partial to my bed that night as in general, so went down to the kitchen with the intent of getting a linseed poultice to put at the back of my, it being calculated to remove pain, as was told to me, when a nuss by a doctor in the hospital, he now bein' in business for hisself, at Geelong, with a large family, havin' married early. Just as I was leaving the kitchen, I heard Mr. Fitzgerald comin' in, and turnin' round, looked at the clock. That havin' been my custom when my late husband came in the early morning, I bein' prepperin' his meal." "And the time was?" asked Mr. Gorby, breathlessly. 5 minutes to 2 o'clock, replied Mrs. Sampson. Mr. Gorby thought for a moment. Cab was hailed at 1 o'clock, started for St. Kilda at about 10 minutes past, reached grammar school, say, at 25 minutes past. Fitzgerald talks 5 minutes to cabman, making it half past. Say he waited 10 minutes for other cab to turn up, makes it 20 minutes to 2. It would take another 20 minutes to get to East Melbourne, and 5 minutes to walk up here. That makes it 5 minutes past 2 instead of before. Confound it. Was your clock in the kitchen right? He asked aloud. Well, I think so, answered Mrs. Sampson. It does get a little slow sometimes. Not even been clean for some time, which my nevy being a watchmaker I allays, and it over to him. Of course it was slow on that night, said Gorby, triumphantly. He must have come in at 5 minutes past 2, which makes it right. Makes what right? Asked the landlady, sharply. And how do you know my clock was 10 minutes wrong? Oh, it was it? Asked Gorby eagerly. I'm not denying of it, replied Mrs. Sampson. Clocks ain't allays to be relied on more than men and women. But it won't be anything agin is insurance, will it? As in general, ease in a 412? Oh, all that will be quite safe, answered the detective, delighted with the information he had obtained. Is this Mr. Fitzgerald's room? Yes, it is, replied the landlady. But he furnished it himself, being of a luxurious turn of mind. Not but what his taste is good, though far be it from me to deny I helped him to select. But even another room of the same to let, any friends as you might have in search of a home, you'd be well looked arter, my references being very high, and my cooking tasty, and if. Here a ring at the front doorbell called Mrs. Sampson away, so with a hurried word to Gorby, she crackled downstairs. Left to himself, Mr. Gorby arose and looked round the room. It was excellently furnished, and the pictures were good. At one end of the room, by the window, there was a writing table covered with papers. It's no good looking for the papers he took out of White's pocket, I suppose, said the detective to himself, as he turned over some letters, as I don't know what they are, and I couldn't tell them if I saw them. But I'd like to find that missing glove and the bottle that held the chloroform, unless he's done away with them. There doesn't seem any sign of them here, so I'll have a look in his bedroom. There was no time to lose, as Mrs. Sampson might return at any moment. So Mr. Gorby walked quickly into the bedroom, which opened off the sitting room. The first thing that caught the detective's eye was a large photograph in a plush frame of Madge Frettleby. It stood on the dressing table and was similar to that one which he had already seen in White's album. He took it up with a laugh. You're a pretty girl, he said, apostrophizing the picture, but you give your photograph to two young men, both in love with you and both hot-tempered. The result is that one is dead and the other won't survive him long. That's what you've done. He put it down again and, looking round the room, caught sight of a light covert coat hanging behind the door and also a soft hat. Ah, said the detective, going up to the door. Here is the very coat you wore when you killed that poor fellow. Wonder what you have in the pockets. And he plunged his hand into them in turn. There were an old theater program and a pair of brown gloves in one, but in the second pocket Mr. Gorby made a discovery. none other than that of the missing glove. There it was, a soiled white glove for the right hand, with black bands down the back, and the detective smiled in a gratified manner as he put it carefully in his pocket. "My morning has not been wasted," he said to himself. "I found out that he came in at a time which corresponds to all his movements after 1 o'clock on Thursday night, and this is the missing glove, which clearly belonged to White. If I could only get hold of the chloroform bottle, I'd be satisfied." But the chloroform bottle was not to be found, though he searched most carefully for it. At last, hearing Mrs. Sampson coming upstairs again, he gave up the search and came back to the sitting room. "Threw it away, I suspect," he said as he sat down in his old place, "but it doesn't matter. I think I can form a chain of evidence, from what I have discovered, which will be sufficient to convict him. Besides, I expect when he is arrested he will confess everything. He seems to feel remorse for what he has done." The door opened, and Mrs. Sampson entered the room in a state of indignation. "One of them Chinese hawkers," she explained. "He's been trying to get the better of me over carrots, as if I didn't know what carrots was, and him talking about a shillin' in his gibberish, as if it ain't been brought up in a place where they don't know what a shillin' is. But I never could abide foreigners ever since a Frenchman, as taught me his language, made orf with my mother's silver teapot, unbeknown to her, it being set out on the sideboard for company." Mr. Gorby interrupted these domestic reminiscences of Mrs. Sampson's by stating that, now she had given him all necessary information, he would take his departure. "And I hopes," said Mrs. Sampson, as she opened the door for him, "as I'll have the pleasure of seeing you again should any business on behalf of Mr. Fitzgerald require it." "Oh, I'll see you again," said Mr. Gorby, with heavy jocularity, "and in a way you won't like, as you'll be called as a witness," he added mentally. "Did I understand you to say, Mrs. Sampson," he went on, "that Mr. Fitzgerald would be at home this afternoon?" "Oh, yes, sir, he will," answered Mrs. Sampson, drinking tea with his young lady, who is Miss Frettleby, and has got no end of money, not but what I mightn't have add the same, had I been born in a higher spear." "You need not tell Mr. Fitzgerald I have been here," said Gorby, closing the gate. "I'll probably call and see him myself this afternoon." "What a stout person ye are," said Mrs. Sampson to herself as the detective walked away, "just like my late father, who was a lays fleshy, being a great eater, and fond of his glass. But I took arter my mother's family, they being thin-like, and proud of keeping themselves so, as the vinegar they drank could testify, not that I indulge in it myself." She shut the door, and went upstairs to take away the breakfast things, while Gorby was being driven along at a good pace to the police office, to obtain a warrant for Brian's arrest, on a charge of willful murder. Chapter 10. In the Queen's Name. It was a broiling hot day, one of those cloudless days, with the blazing sun beating down on the arid streets and casting deep, black shadows. A real Australian December day, dropped by mistake of the clerk of the weather into the middle of August. The previous week having been really chilly, it was all the more welcome. It was Saturday morning, and fashionable Melbourne was doing the block. Collins Street is to the southern city what Bond Street and the Row are to London and the boulevards to Paris. It is on the block that people show off their new dresses, bow to their friends, cut their enemies, and chatter small talk. The same thing no doubt occurred in the Appian Way, the fashionable street of imperial Rome, when Catullus talked gay nonsense to Lesbia, and Horace received the congratulations of his friends over his new volume of Society Verses. History repeats itself, and every city is bound by all the laws of civilization to have one special street, wherein the votaries of fashion can congregate. Collins Street is not, of course, such a grand thoroughfare as those above mentioned, but the people who stroll up and down the broad pavement are quite as charmingly dressed, and as pleasant as any of the peripatetics of those famous cities. As the sun brings out bright flowers, so the seductive influence of the hot weather had brought out all the ladies in gay dresses of innumerable colors, which made the long street look like a restless rainbow. Carriages were bowling smoothly along, their occupants smiling and bowing as they recognized their friends on the sidewalk. Lawyers, their legal quibbles finished for the week, were strolling leisurely with their black bags in their hands. Portly merchants, forgetting Flinders Lane and incoming ships, walked beside their pretty daughters, and the representatives of Swelldom were stalking along in their customary apparel of curly-brimmed hats, high collars, and immaculate suits. Altogether, it was a pleasant and animated scene, which would have delighted the heart of anyone who was not dyspeptic or in love. Dyspeptic people and lovers, disappointed ones, of course, being wont to survey the world in a cynical vein. Madge Frettleby was engaged in that occupation so dear to every female heart, shopping. She was in Mowbray, Rowan, and Hicks, turning over ribbons and laces, while the faithful Brian waited for her outside, and amused himself by looking at the human stream which flowed along the pavement. He disliked shopping quite as much as the majority of his sex, and though as a lover he felt a certain amount of self-abnegation to be becoming in him, it was difficult to drive away the thoughts of his pleasant club, where he could be reading and smoking, with perchance something cooling in a glass beside him. However, after she had purchased a dozen or more articles she did not want, Madge remembered that Brian was waiting for her, and hurried to the door. "I haven't been many minutes, have I, dear?" she said, touching him lightly on the arm. "Oh, dear no," answered Brian, looking at his watch. "Only 30, a mere nothing, considering a new dress was being discussed." "I thought I had been longer," said Madge, her brow clearing. "But still I am sure you feel a martyr." "Not at all," replied Fitzgerald, handing her into the carriage. "I enjoyed myself very much." "Nonsense," she laughed, opening her sunshade, while Brian took his seat beside her. "That's one of those social stories, which every one considers themselves bound to tell from a sense of duty. I'm afraid I did keep you waiting. Though, after all," she went on, with a true feminine idea as to the flight of time, "I was only a few minutes." "And the rest," said Brian, quizzically looking at her pretty face, so charmingly flushed under her great white hat. Madge disdained to notice this interruption. "James," she cried to the coachman, "drive to the Melbourne Club. Papa will be there, you know," she said to Brian, "and we'll take him off to have tea with us." "But it's only 1 o'clock," said Brian, as the town hall clock came in sight. "Mrs. Sampson won't be ready." "Oh, anything will do," replied Madge. "A cup of tea and some thin bread and butter isn't hard to prepare. I don't feel like lunch, and Papa eats so little in the middle of the day, and you eat a great deal at all times," finished Brian with a laugh. Madge went on chattering in her usual lively manner, and Brian listened to her with delight. Her pleasant talk drove away the evil spirit which had been with him for the last 3 weeks. Suddenly Madge made an observation as they were passing the Burke and Wills monument, which startled him. "Isn't that the place where Mr. White got into the cab?" she asked, looking at the corner near the Scotch church, where a vagrant of musical tendencies was playing, just before the battle, mother, on a battered old concertina. "So the papers say," answered Brian, listlessly, without turning his head. "I wonder who the gentleman in the light coat could have been," said Madge, as she settled herself again. "No one seems to know," he replied evasively. "Ah, but they have a clue," she said. "Do you know, Brian," she went on, "that he was dressed just like you in a light overcoat and soft hat?" "How remarkable," said Fitzgerald, speaking in a slightly sarcastic tone and as calmly as he was able. "He was dressed in the same manner as 9 out of every 10 young fellows in Melbourne." Madge looked at him in surprise at the tone in which he spoke, so different from his usual nonchalant way of speaking. She was about to answer when the carriage stopped at the door of the Melbourne Club. Brian, anxious to escape any more remarks about the murder, sprang quickly out and ran up the steps into the building. He found Mr. Frettleby smoking complacently and reading the AG. As Fitzgerald entered, he looked up and, putting down the paper, held out his hand, which the other took. "Ah, Fitzgerald," he said, "have you left the attractions of Collins Street for the still greater ones of Clubland?" "Not I," answered Brian. "I've come to carry you off to afternoon tea with Madge and myself." "I don't mind," answered Mr. Frettleby, rising. "But isn't afternoon tea at 1:30 rather an anomaly?" "What's in a name?" said Fitzgerald, absently, as they left the room. "What have you been doing all morning?" "I've been in here for the last half-hour reading," answered the other, carelessly. "Woolmarket, I suppose?" "No, the Hansom Cab murder." "Oh, that thing," said Brian, hastily. Then, seeing his companion looking at him in surprise, he apologized. "But, indeed," he went on, "I'm nearly worried to death by people asking about White, as if I knew all about him, whereas I know nothing." "Just as well you don't," answered Mr. Frettleby, as they descended the steps together. He was not a very desirable companion. It was on the tip of Brian's tongue to say, and yet you wanted him to marry your daughter. But he wisely refrained, and they reached the carriage in silence. "Now then, Papa," said Madge when they were all settled in the carriage, and it was rolling along smoothly in the direction of East Melbourne. "What have you been doing?" "Enjoying myself," answered her father, "until you and Brian came and dragged me out into this blazing sunshine." "Well, Brian has been so good of late," said Madge, "that I had to reward him, so I knew that nothing would please him better than to play host." "Certainly," said Brian, rousing himself out of a fit of abstraction, "especially when one has such charming visitors." Madge laughed at this and made a little grimace. "If your tea is only equal to your compliments," she said lightly, "I'm sure Papa will forgive us for dragging him away from his club." "Papa will forgive anything," murmured Mr. Frettleby, tilting his hat over his eyes, "so long as he gets somewhere out of the sun. I can't say I care about playing the parts of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace of a Melbourne hot day." "There now, Papa is quite a host in himself," said Madge mischievously, as the carriage drew up at Mrs. Sampson's door. "No, you are wrong," said Brian, as he alighted and helped her out. "I am the host in myself this time." "If there is one thing I hate above another," observed Miss Frettleby calmly, "it's a pun, and especially a bad one." Mrs. Sampson was very much astonished at the early arrival of her lodger's guests, and did not hesitate to express her astonishment. "Bein' taken by surprise," she said with an apologetic cackle. "It ain't to be supposed as miracles can be performed with regard to cooking, the fire having gone out, not being kept alight on account of the heat of the day, which was that OT as never was, though, to be sure, being a child in the early days, I remember it were that OT as my sister's aunt was in the bit of roastin' her jints in the sun." After telling this last romance, and leaving her visitors in doubt whether the joints referred to belong to an animal or to her sister's aunt or to herself, Mrs. Sampson crackled away downstairs to get things ready. "What a curious thing that landlady of yours is, Brian," said Madge, from the depths of a huge armchair. "I believe she's a grasshopper from the Fitzroy Gardens." "Oh no, she's a woman," said Mr. Frettleby cynically. "You can tell that by the length of her tongue." "A popular error, Papa," retorted Madge sharply. "I know plenty of men who talk far more than any woman." "I hope I'll never meet them then," said Mr. Frettleby, "for if I did I should be inclined to agree with De Quincey on murder as a fine art." Brian winced at this, and looked apprehensively at Madge, and saw with relief that she was not paying attention to her father, but was listening intently. "There she is," as a faint rustle at the door announced the arrival of Mrs. Sampson and the tea tray. "I wonder, Brian, you don't think the house is on fire with that queer noise always going on? She wants oil." "Yes, St. Jacob's oil," laughed Brian, as Mrs. Sampson entered, and placed her burden on the table. "Not even any cake," said that lady, through not being forewarned as to the time of arrival, "though it's not often I'm taken by surprise, except as to a headache, which of course is accidental to every poosin. I ain't got nothing but bread and butter, the baker and grocer both bein' all that could be desired, except in the way of worryin' for their money, which they thinks is how I keeps the bank in the ooze like a lading's cave. As I've heard tell in the Arabian Nights, me avin gained it as a prize for English in my early girlhood, bein' then considered a scholard and industrious." Mrs. Sampson's shrill apologies for the absence of cake having been received, she hopped out of the room, and Madge made the tea. The service was a quaint Chinese one, which Brian had picked up in his wanderings. He used it only on special occasions. As he watched Madge, he could not help thinking how pretty she looked, with her hands moving deftly among the cups and saucers, so bizarre-looking with their sprawling dragons of yellow and green. He half smiled to himself as he thought, "If they knew all, I wonder if they would sit with me so unconcernedly." Mr. Frettleby, too, as he looked at his daughter, thought of his dead wife and sighed. "Well," said Madge as she handed them their tea, and helped herself to some thin bread and butter, "you two gentlemen are most delightful company. Papa is sighing like a furnace, and Brian is staring at me with his eyes like blue china saucers. You ought both to be turned forth to funerals like melancholy." "Why like melancholy?" queried Brian lazily. "I'm afraid, Mr. Fitzgerald," said the young lady with a smile in her pretty black eyes, "that you are not a student of A Midsummer Night's Dream?" "Very likely not," answered Brian. "Midsummer out here is so hot that one gets no sleep and, consequently, no dreams. Depend upon it, if the four lovers whom Puck treated so badly had lived in Australia, they wouldn't have been able to sleep for the mosquitoes." "What nonsense you two young people do talk," said Mr. Frettleby, with an amused smile, as he stirred his tea. "Dulce est desiderum loco," observed Brian gravely. "A man who can't carry out that observation is sure not to be up to much." "I don't like Latin," said Miss Frettleby, shaking her pretty head. "I agree with Heine's remark, that if the Romans had been forced to learn it, they would not have found time to conquer the world." "Which was a much more agreeable task," said Brian. "And more profitable," finished Mr. Frettleby. They chattered in this desultory fashion for a considerable time, till at last Madge rose and said they must go. Brian proposed to dine with them at St. Kilda, and then they would all go to Brock's fireworks. Madge consented to this, and she was just pulling on her gloves when suddenly they heard a ring at the front door, and presently Mrs. Sampson talking in an excited manner at the pitch of her voice. "You shan't come in, I tell you," they heard her say shrilly. "So it's no good trying, which I've allays erred as an Englishman's ooze is Castle, and you're breaking the law, as well as a-spiling the carpets, which has been newly put down." Someone made a reply. Then the door of Brian's room was thrown open, and Gorby walked in, followed by another man. Fitzgerald turned as white as a sheet, for he felt instinctively that they had come for him. However, pulling himself together, he demanded, in a haughty tone, the reason of the intrusion. Mr. Gorby walked straight over to where Brian was standing, and placed his hand on the young man's shoulder. "Brian Fitzgerald," he said, in a clear voice, "I arrest you in the Queen's name." "For what?" asked Brian, steadily. "The murder of Oliver White." At this Madge gave a cry. "It is not true," she said wildly. "My God, it's not true." Brian did not answer, but ghastly pale, held out his hands. Gorby slipped the handcuffs onto his wrists with a feeling of compunction, despite his joy in running his man down. This done, Fitzgerald turned round to where Madge was standing, pale and still, as though turned into stone. "Madge," he said in a clear, low voice, "I am going to prison, perhaps to death, but I swear to you, by all that I hold most sacred, that I am innocent of this murder." "My darling!" She made a step forward, but her father stepped before her. "Keep back," he said in a hard voice. "There is nothing between you and that man now." She turned round with an ashen face, but with a proud look in her clear eyes. "You are wrong," she answered, with a touch of scorn in her voice. "I love him more now than ever." Then, before her father could stop her, she placed her arms round her lover's neck and kissed him wildly. "My darling," she said, with the tears streaming down her white cheeks, "whatever the world may say, you are always dearest of all to me." Brian kissed her passionately and moved away. Madge fell down at her father's feet in a dead faint. Chapter 11. Counsel for the prisoner. Brian Fitzgerald was arrested at a few minutes past 3 o'clock, and by 5 all Melbourne was ringing with the news that the perpetrator of the now famous Hansom Cab murder had been caught. The evening papers were full of the affair, and the Herald went through several editions, the demand being far in the excess of the supply. Such a crime had not been committed in Melbourne since the Greer shooting case in the Opera House, and the mystery by which it was surrounded made it even more sensational. The committal of the crime in such an extraordinary place as a hansom cab had been startling enough, but the discovery that the assassin was one of the most fashionable young men in Melbourne was still more so. Brian Fitzgerald being well known in society as a wealthy squatter, and the future husband of one of the richest and prettiest girls in Victoria, it was no wonder that his arrest caused some sensation. The Herald, which was fortunate enough to obtain the earliest information about the arrest, made the best use of it, and published a flaming article in its most sensational type, somewhat after this fashion. Hansom Cab Tragedy. Arrest of the supposed murderer. Startling revelations in high life. It is needless to say that some of the reporters had painted the lily pretty freely, but the public were ready to believe everything that came out in the papers. Mr. Frettleby, the day after Brian's arrest, had a long conversation with his daughter, and wanted her to go up to Yaba Yaluk station until the public excitement had somewhat subsided. But this Madge flatly refused to do. "I'm not going to desert him when he most needs me," she said, resolutely. "Everybody has turned against him, even before they have heard the facts of the case. He says he is not guilty, and I believe him." "Then let him prove his innocence," said her father, who was pacing slowly up and down the room. "If he did not get into the cab with White, he must have been somewhere else. So he ought to set up the defense of an alibi." "He can easily do that," said Madge, with a ray of hope lighting up her sad face. "He was here till 11 o'clock on Thursday night." "Very probably," returned her father, dryly. "But where was he at 1 o'clock on Friday morning? Besides, Mr. White left the house long before Brian did," she went on rapidly. "You must remember, it was when you quarreled with Mr. White." "My dear Madge," said Frettleby, stopping in front of her with a displeased look, "you are incorrect. White and myself did not quarrel. He asked me if it were true that Fitzgerald was engaged to you, and I answered yes. That was all, and then he left the house." "Yes, and Brian didn't go until 2 hours after," said Madge, triumphantly. "He never saw Mr. White the whole night." "So he says," replied Mr. Frettleby, significantly. "I believe Brian before anyone else in the world," said his daughter, hotly, with flushed cheeks and flashing eyes. "Ah, but will a jury?" queried her father. "You have turned against him, too," answered Madge, her eyes filling with tears. "You believe him guilty." "I am not prepared either to deny or confirm his guilt," said Mr. Frettleby, coldly. "I have done what I could to help him. I have engaged Carlton to defend him, and if eloquence and skill can save him, you may set your mind at rest." "My dear father," said Madge, throwing her arms round his neck, "I knew you would not desert him altogether for my sake." "My darling," replied her father, in a faltering voice, as he kissed her, "there is nothing in the world I would not do for your sake." Meanwhile, Brian was sitting in his cell in the Melbourne jail, thinking sadly enough about his position. He saw no hope of escape except one, and that he did not intend to take advantage of. "It would kill her. It would kill her," he said, feverishly, as he paced to and fro over the echoing stones. "Better that the last of the Fitzgeralds should perish like a common thief than that she should know the bitter truth. If I engage a lawyer to defend me," he went on, "the first question he will ask me will be where was I on that night, and if I tell him all will be discovered, and then no, I cannot do it. It would kill her, my darling," and throwing himself down on the bed, he covered his face with his hands. He was roused by the opening of the door of his cell, and on looking up saw that it was Carlton who entered. He was a great friend of Fitzgerald's, and Brian was deeply touched by his kindness in coming to see him. Duncan Carlton had a kindly heart and was anxious to help Brian, but there was also a touch of self-interest in the matter. He had received a note from Mr. Frettleby, asking him to defend Fitzgerald, which he agreed to do with avidity, as he foresaw in this case an opportunity for his name becoming known throughout the Australian colonies. It is true that he was already a celebrated lawyer, but his reputation was purely a local one, and as he foresaw that Fitzgerald's trial for murder would cause a great sensation throughout Australia and New Zealand, he determined to take advantage of it as another step in the ladder which led to fame, wealth, and position. So this tall, keen-eyed man, with the clean-shaven face and expressive mouth, advanced into the cell and took Brian by the hand. "It is very kind of you to come and see me," said Fitzgerald. "It is at a time like this that one appreciates friendship." "Yes, of course," answered the lawyer, fixing his keen eyes on the other's haggard face, as if he would read his innermost thoughts. "I came partly on my own account, and partly because Frettleby asked me to see you as to your defense." "Mr. Frettleby?" said Brian, in a mechanical way. "He is very kind. I thought he believed me guilty." "No man is considered guilty until he has been proved so," answered Carlton, evasively. Brian noticed how guarded the answer was, for he heaved an impatient sigh. "And Miss Frettleby?" he asked, in a hesitating manner. This time he got a decided answer. "She declines to believe you guilty, and will not hear a word said against you." "God bless her," said Brian, fervently. "She is a true woman. I suppose I am pretty well canvassed," he added bitterly. "Nothing else talked about," answered Carlton calmly. "Your arrest has for the present suspended all interest in theaters, cricket matches, and balls, and you are at the present moment being discussed threadbare in clubs and drawing rooms." Fitzgerald writhed. He was a singularly proud man, and there was something inexpressibly galling in this unpleasant publicity. "But this is all idle chatter," said Carlton, taking a seat. "We must get to business. Of course, you will accept me as your counsel." "It's no good my doing so," replied Brian gloomily. "The rope is already round my neck." "Nonsense," replied the lawyer, cheerfully. "The rope is round no man's neck until he is on the scaffold. Now, you need not say a word," he went on, holding up his hand as Brian was about to speak. "I intend to defend you, whether you like it or not. I do not know all the facts, except what the papers have stated, and they exaggerate so much that one can place no reliance on them. At all events, I believe from my heart that you are innocent, and you must walk out of the prisoner's dock a free man, if only for the sake of that noble girl who loves you." Brian did not answer, but put out his hand, which the other grasped warmly. "I will not deny," went on Carlton, "that there is a little bit of professional curiosity about me. This case is such an extraordinary one that I feel as if I were unable to let slip an opportunity of doing something with it. I don't care for your humdrum murders with the poker and all that sort of thing, but this is something clever and therefore interesting. When you are safe, we will look together for the real criminal, and the pleasure of the search will be proportionate to the excitement when we find him out." "I agree with everything you say," said Fitzgerald, calmly, "but I have no defense to make." "No defense? You are not going to confess you killed him?" "No," with an angry flush, "but there are certain circumstances which prevent me from defending myself." "What nonsense," retorted Carlton, sharply, as if any circumstances should prevent a man from saving his own life. "But never mind, I like these objections. They make the nut harder to crack, but the kernel must be worth getting at. Now, I want you to answer certain questions. I won't promise." "Well, we shall see," said the lawyer, cheerfully, taking out his notebook and resting it on his knee. "First, where were you on the Thursday night preceding the murder?" "I can't tell you." "Oh, yes you can, my friend. You left St. Kilda and came up to town by the 11 o'clock train." 11:20, corrected Brian. Carlton smiled in a gratified manner as he noted this down. "A little diplomacy is all that's required," he said mentally. "And where did you go then?" he added aloud. "I met Ralston in the train, and we took a cab from the Flinders Street station up to the club." "What club?" "The Melbourne Club." "Yes?" interrogatively. "Ralston went home, and I went into the club and played cards for a time." "When did you leave the club?" "A few minutes to 1 o'clock in the morning." "And then, I suppose, you went home?" "No, I did not." "Then where did you go?" "Down the street." "Rather vague. I presume you mean Collins Street?" "Yes." "You were going to meet someone, I suppose?" "I never said so." "Probably not. But young men don't wander about the streets at night without some object." "I was restless and wanted a walk." "Indeed. How curious you should prefer going into the heart of the dusty town for a walk to strolling through the Fitzroy Gardens, which were on your way home." "It won't do. You had an appointment to meet someone." "Well, or yes. I thought as much." "Man or woman?" "I cannot tell you." "Then I must find out for myself." "You can't?" "Indeed." "Why not?" "You don't know where to look for her." "Her," cried Carlton, delighted at the success of his craftily put question. "I knew it was a woman." Brian did not answer, but sat biting his lips with vexation. "Now, who is this woman?" No answer. "Come now, Fitzgerald. I know that young men will be young men, and, of course, you don't like these things talked about. But in this case your character must be sacrificed to save your neck." "What is her name?" "I can't tell you." "Oh, you know it then?" "Well, yes." "And you won't tell me?" "No." Carlton, however, had found out two things that pleased him. First, that Fitzgerald had an appointment, and, second, that it had been with a woman. He pursued another line. "When did you last see White?" Brian answered with great reluctance. "I saw him drunk by the Scotch church." "What? You were the man who hailed the hansom?" "Yes," assented the other, hesitating slightly. "I was—" The thought flashed through Carlton's brain as to whether the young man before him was guilty or not, and he was obliged to confess that things looked very black against him. Then what the newspapers said was correct? Partly. Ah. Carlton drew a long breath. Here was a ray of hope. You did not know it was White when you found him lying drunk near the Scotch church. No, I did not. Had I known it was he, I would not have picked him up. Of course. You recognized him afterwards? Yes, I did. And, as the paper stated, I dropped him and walked away. Why did you leave him so abruptly? Brian looked at his questioner in some surprise. Because I detested him, he said shortly. Why did you detest him? No answer. Was it because he admired Miss Frettleby, and from all appearances was going to marry her? Well, yes, sullenly. And now, said Carlton impressively, this is the whole point upon which the case turns. Why did you get into the cab with him? I did not get into the cab. The cabman declares that you did. He is wrong. I never came back after I recognized White. Then who was the man who got into the cab with White? I don't know. You have no idea? Not the least. You are certain? Yes, perfectly certain. He seems to have been dressed exactly like you. Very probably. I could name at least a dozen of my acquaintances who wore light coats over their evening dress and soft hats. Do you know if White had any enemies? No, I don't. I know nothing about him, beyond that he came from England a short time ago with a letter of introduction to Mr. Frettleby and had the impertinence to ask Madge to marry him. Where did White live? Down in St. Kilda, at the end of Grey Street. How do you know? It was in the papers, and hesitatingly, I called on him. Why? To see if he would cease his attentions to Madge, and to tell him that she was engaged to me. And what did he say? Laughed at me. Curse him. You had high words, evidently. Brian laughed bitterly. Yes, we had. Did anyone hear you? The landlady did, I think. I saw her in the passage as I left the house. The prosecution will bring her forward as a witness. Very likely, indifferently. Did you say anything likely to incriminate yourself? Fitzgerald turned away his head. Yes, he answered in a low voice. I spoke very wildly. Indeed, I did not know at the time what I said. Did you threaten him? Yes, I did. I told him I would kill him if he persisted in his plan of marrying Madge. Ah, if the landlady can swear that she heard you say so, it will form a strong piece of evidence against you. So far as I can see, there is only one defense, and that is an easy one. You must prove an alibi. No answer. You say you did not come back and get into the cab, said Carlton, watching the face of the other closely. No, it was someone else dressed like me. And you have no idea who it was? No, I have not. Then, after you left White and walked along Russell Street, where did you go? I can't tell you. Were you intoxicated? No, indignantly. Then you remember? Yes. And where were you? I can't tell you. You refuse. Yes, I do. Take time to consider. You may have to pay a heavy price for your refusal. If necessary, I will pay it. And you won't tell me where you were? No, I won't. Carlton was beginning to feel annoyed. You're very foolish, he said, sacrificing your life to some feeling of false modesty. You must prove an alibi. No answer. At what hour did you get home? About 2 o'clock in the morning. Did you walk home? Yes. Through the Fitzroy Gardens. Did you see anyone on your way home? I don't know. I wasn't paying attention. Did anyone see you? Not that I know of. Then you refuse to tell me where you were between 1 and 2 o'clock on Friday morning? Absolutely. Carlton thought for a moment to consider his next move. Did you know that White carried valuable papers about with him? Fitzgerald hesitated and turned pale. No, I did not know, he said reluctantly. The lawyer made a masterstroke. Then why did you take them from him? What? Had he it with him? Carlton saw his advantage and seized it at once. Yes, he had it with him. Why did you take it? I did not take it. I didn't even know he had it with him. Indeed. Will you kindly tell me what it is? Brian saw the trap into which he had fallen. No, I will not, he answered steadily. Was it a jewel? No. Was it an important paper? I don't know. Ah, it was a paper. I can see it in your face. And was that paper of importance to you? Why do you ask? Carlton fixed his keen gray eyes steadily on Brian's face. Because, he answered slowly, the man to whom that paper was of such value murdered White. Brian started up, ghastly pale. My God! He almost shrieked, stretching out his hands. It is true after all, and he fell down on the stone pavement in a dead faint. Carlton, alarmed, summoned the jailer, and between them, they placed him on the bed and dashed some cold water over his face. He recovered and moaned feebly, while Carlton, seeing that he was unfit to be spoken to, left the prison. When he got outside, he stopped for a moment and looked back on the grim, gray walls. Brian Fitzgerald, he said to himself, you did not commit the murder yourself, but you know who did. Thank you for listening to The Mystery of a Hansom Cab by Fergus Hume. If you enjoyed this part, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more classic stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know your favorite moment from this part. Stay tuned for the next installment, coming soon. See you next time.